The scientific community of the mid-19th century faced a perplexing puzzle that would ultimately give birth to one of geology's most enduring hypotheses. Scattered across the Indian Ocean from the tropical forests of Madagascar to the western Ghats of India and extending into the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, paleontologists had discovered fossilized remains of lemurs and related primates that defied conventional understanding of animal distribution. These discoveries created what appeared to be an impossible geographic pattern: closely related species separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, with no apparent means of crossing such vast aquatic barriers. Philip Lutley Sclater, a distinguished British zoologist and ornithologist, confronted this biogeographical enigma with the methodical precision that characterised Victorian scientific inquiry. Born into a family of legal professionals in 1829, Sclater had abandoned his law studies at Oxford to pursue his passion for natural history, eventually becoming one of the most respected authorities on bird classification of his era. His expertise in animal distribution patterns across different continents had earned him recognition throughout European scientific circles, making him uniquely positioned to tackle the lemur distribution mystery. In 1864, Sclater published his groundbreaking paper in the Quarterly Journal of Science, proposing what would become known as the Lemuria hypothesis. His reasoning followed a logical progression that reflected the geological understanding of his time. If lemurs and their fossilized ancestors appeared in Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia, yet were absent from Africa and other intervening land masses, then these regions must have once been connected by land. The alternative explanation, that these primates had somehow crossed vast oceanic distances, seemed impossible given their terrestrial nature and the absence of any known mechanism for such long-distance dispersal. Sclater's proposed landmass stretched across the Indian Ocean, connecting present-day Madagascar with the Indian subcontinent and extending eastward toward the Malay Peninsula. He named this hypothetical continent Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution had sparked his investigation. The continent, according to his calculations, must have existed during the Tertiary period and subsequently sunk beneath the ocean waves, leaving only scattered islands and peninsulas as remnants of its former expanse. The geological framework supporting Sclater's hypothesis drew heavily upon contemporary understanding of Earth's crustal movements. 19th century geologists operated under the assumption that the planet's surface remained relatively stable, with vertical movements representing the primary mechanism for topographical change. Mountain ranges rose through uplift, while other areas subsided and disappeared beneath rising seas. This vertical mobility model made the concept of a sunken continent entirely plausible within existing scientific paradigms. Charles Darwin encountered Sclater's Lemuria hypothesis during a period when his own theoretical framework desperately needed supporting evidence for biogeographical patterns. The publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 had introduced the scientific world to evolutionary theory, but Darwin recognized that his ideas required robust explanations for the distribution of related species across seemingly impossible geographic barriers. The land bridge concept offered an elegant solution to numerous biogeographical puzzles that had long troubled naturalists. Darwin's correspondence from the 1860s reveals his growing enthusiasm for land bridge explanations. Writing to fellow scientists, he expressed particular interest in how such connections might explain the presence of similar flora and fauna on continents separated by vast oceans. The Lemuria hypothesis provided a concrete example of how evolutionary relationships could be reconciled with geographic distribution patterns. If related species appeared on distant landmasses, their common ancestors must have inhabited the connecting bridges before geological subsidence isolated the populations. The integration of Lemuria into evolutionary biogeography gained momentum as Darwin incorporated land bridge theories into his broader explanatory framework. In The Descent of Man, published in 1871, Darwin referenced the potential importance of former land connections in explaining primate distribution patterns. He argued that the geographic isolation resulting from continental subsidence could drive evolutionary divergence, creating the distinct but related species observed across different regions. Darwin's support for the land bridge hypothesis extended beyond mere acceptance. He actively promoted it as a crucial component of evolutionary explanation. His scientific stature lent considerable credibility to Sclater's proposal, encouraging other researchers to explore similar hypotheses for different geographic regions. This concept of sunken continents began appearing in scientific literature with increasing frequency, applied to explain distribution patterns for various animal and plant groups. Ernst Haeckel, the influential German biologist and philosopher, seized upon the Lemuria hypothesis with characteristic enthusiasm and expanded its implications far beyond Sclater's original zoological focus. Haeckel had established himself as one of Darwin's most vocal supporters on the European continent, but he possessed a tendency towards speculative theorizing that often exceeded the bounds of available evidence. His adoption of Lemuria transformed the hypothesis from a specific explanation for lemur distribution into a grand narrative about human evolutionary origins. In Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, published in 1876, Haeckel presented Lemuria as the probable birthplace of humanity. His reasoning followed a logical progression based on contemporary understanding of primate relationships. If lemurs and other early primates had inhabited Lemuria, and if humans shared common ancestry with these primates, then the sunken continent represented the most likely location for human evolutionary origins. Haeckel's enthusiasm for this idea reflected his broader commitment to materialist explanations for human development, rejecting religious accounts of creation in favour of naturalistic processes. Haeckel's vision of Lemuria differed substantially from Sclater's original conception, where the British zoologist had proposed a relatively modest landmass connecting specific regions. Haeckel envisioned a vast tropical paradise that had nurtured the earliest human ancestors. His descriptions emphasized the continent's favourable climate and abundant resources, creating an idealized environment for evolutionary development. This expansion of the Lemuria concept reflected Haeckel's tendency to extrapolate far beyond available evidence, a characteristic that would later contribute to the hypothesis's transformation from scientific theory to popular mythology. The scientific context of the 1860s and 1870s made land bridge hypotheses not merely plausible but practically necessary for explaining observed biogeographical patterns. Geologists of this period operated without knowledge of plate tectonics, continental drift, or the dynamic processes that actually govern crustal movement. The concept of horizontally moving continents remained entirely foreign to scientific thinking, with Alfred Wegener's continental drift theory still decades in the future. Within this framework of geological understanding, vertical movements represented the only available mechanism for explaining how land masses might appear and disappear over geological time. The absence of continental drift theory created significant explanatory gaps in 19th century geology. Researchers could observe striking similarities between fossil assemblages on different continents, note matching rock formations across ocean basins, and document identical species distributions on widely separated land masses, but they lacked any theoretical framework for explaining these patterns through horizontal, crustal movement. Land bridges offered the only viable solution within existing scientific paradigms, providing a mechanism for biological and geological connections between distant regions. Contemporary geological surveys had begun revealing the complexity of ocean floor topography, though the technology for detailed mapping remained primitive by modern standards. Early bathymetric studies suggested that submarine ridges and plateaus might represent remnants of former land connections, lending apparent support to land bridge theories. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, discovered through cable-laying operations, seemed to indicate a submerged mountain range that might once have connected Europe and North America. Similar features in the Indian Ocean appear to support Sclatter's Lemuria hypothesis. The scientific establishment's acceptance of land bridge explanations reflected broader patterns in 19th century natural philosophy. Researchers of this period demonstrated remarkable skill in observation and classification, but often struggled with theoretical frameworks that could accommodate dynamic geological processes. The concept of uniformitarianism, popularized by Charles Lyell, emphasized gradual change over vast time periods, but focused primarily on vertical crustal movements rather than horizontal displacement. This theoretical limitation made land bridges appear not merely plausible but inevitable for explaining biogeographical distributions. Sclater's original Lemuria hypothesis gained additional support from contemporary research into ocean currents and climate patterns. Scientists recognized that the Indian Ocean's current systems would make biological dispersal between Madagascar and India extremely difficult for terrestrial organisms. The prevailing winds and surface currents flowed in directions that would prevent rafting or other forms of accidental transport. This oceanographic evidence strengthened the case for former land connections, making Lemuria appear necessary rather than merely convenient for explaining lemur distribution. The integration of Lemuria into broader scientific discourse reflected the collaborative nature of Victorian natural history research. Scientists regularly corresponded across national boundaries, sharing observations and theoretical insights that contributed to collective understanding of natural phenomena. Sclatter's hypothesis gained credibility through this network of scientific communication, with researchers in different countries providing supporting evidence from their own regional studies. Fossil discoveries in India confirmed the presence of lemur ancestors, while geological surveys in Madagascar revealed rock formations consistent with former continental connections. The scientific foundation that Philip Sclatter and his contemporaries had established for the Lemuria hypothesis would undergo a radical metamorphosis in the hands of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian-born occultist whose ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and scientific terminology would forever alter the concept's trajectory. By the 1880s, Blavatsky had already established herself as a controversial figure in the burgeoning spiritualist movement, claiming direct communication with advanced spiritual beings and positioning herself as the primary conduit for ancient wisdom traditions that predated conventional historical records. Blavatsky's early life had been marked by extensive travels throughout Europe, the Middle East and Asia, journeys that exposed her to diverse religious and philosophical traditions, while providing her with a vast repository of cultural references that would later inform her esoteric writings. Born into minor Russian nobility in 1831, she demonstrated an early fascination with the supernatural and claimed to possess psychic abilities that manifested during childhood. Her adolescent years were characterized by rebellious behavior and an insatiable curiosity about mystical traditions, leading her to abandon conventional social expectations in favor of a life dedicated to spiritual exploration. The formative experiences that shaped Blavatsky's worldview occurred during her claimed travels to Tibet and India in the 1850s and 1860s, though historians have found little concrete evidence to support many of her assertions about these journeys. Regardless of their factual accuracy, these purported experiences provided Blavatsky with detailed knowledge of Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Tibetan spiritual practices, and esoteric traditions that she would later incorporate into her theosophical system. Her familiarity with Sanskrit terminology, yogic concepts, and Eastern philosophical frameworks demonstrated either genuine study or remarkable autodidactic achievement in acquiring knowledge about Asian religious traditions. When Blavatsky encountered Sclatter's Lemuria hypothesis in the scientific literature of the 1870s, she immediately recognized its potential for incorporation into her developing cosmological framework. The concept of a lost continent aligned perfectly with her claims about ancient civilizations that had achieved spiritual and technological advancement far exceeding modern capabilities. Rather than viewing Lemuria as a biogeographical solution to lemur distribution patterns, Blavatsky perceived it as a missing piece in humanity's spiritual evolution, a stage in the cosmic development of consciousness that conventional history had overlooked. The publication of Does the Secret Doctrine in 1888 marked the definitive transformation of Lemuria from scientific hypothesis to esoteric doctrine. Blavatsky's massive 2-volume work attempted nothing less than a complete reinterpretation of human history, cosmic evolution, and spiritual development, drawing upon sources that ranged from legitimate scientific publications to claimed ancient manuscripts of dubious provenance. Within this ambitious synthesis, Lemuria occupied a central position as the homeland of what Blavatsky termed the Third Root Race, a stage in humanity's spiritual evolution that had occurred millions of years ago. Blavatsky's appropriation of the Lemuria concept involved a fundamental departure from its scientific origins. Where Sclater had proposed a continent to explain lemur distribution patterns, and Haeckel had suggested it as a possible location for human evolutionary origins, Blavatsky transformed Lemuria into the setting for an elaborate mythological narrative about spiritual evolution. Her Lemurians were not primitive early humans struggling for survival, but advanced beings who possessed psychic abilities, communicated telepathically, and maintained direct contact with spiritual hierarchies that guided planetary development. The cosmological framework that Blavatsky constructed around Lemuria drew heavily upon Hindu concepts of cyclical time and evolutionary stages, though she adapted these traditions to accommodate her own unique interpretations. According to her system, humanity progressed through 7 root races, each representing a distinct phase of spiritual and physical development. The first root race had been purely spiritual beings without physical form, while the second root race began the process of materialization. The third root race, inhabiting Lemuria, marked the point where spiritual beings fully incarnated into physical bodies while retaining many of their psychic capabilities. Blavatsky's description of Lemurian civilization emphasized its spiritual advancement and technological sophistication. These beings allegedly possessed the ability to manipulate matter through mental concentration, communicate across vast distances without physical instruments, and maintain conscious contact with advanced spiritual teachers who guided their development. The Lemurians lived in harmony with natural forces, understanding principles of energy manipulation that modern science had yet to discover. Their society was organized according to spiritual hierarchy rather than political authority, with the most evolved individuals serving as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms. The geographical extent of Blavatsky's Lemuria far exceeded Sclater's original conception. While the zoologist had proposed a landmass connecting Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia, Blavatsky described a vast continent that encompassed much of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Her Lemuria included present-day Australia, parts of Asia, various Pacific islands, and extended into areas that would later become the Americas. This expanded geography allowed her to incorporate diverse cultural traditions and archaeological mysteries into her Lemurian narrative, suggesting that various ancient monuments and artifacts represented remnants of this lost civilization. The destruction of Lemuria, according to Blavatsky's account, resulted from the spiritual degeneration of its inhabitants rather than natural geological processes. As the third root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, many Lemurians began to abuse their psychic abilities for selfish purposes, engaging in practices that violated cosmic law and disrupted the harmony between spiritual and material realms. This moral decline attracted destructive forces that ultimately led to the continent's submersion beneath the oceans, though some evolved Lemurians escaped to other regions where they established mystery schools to preserve their knowledge. Blavatsky's integration of Lemuria into her broader theosophical system required extensive borrowing from existing esoteric traditions, which she claimed represented fragments of ancient wisdom preserved through secret initiatory lineages. She drew upon Gnostic cosmology, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalistic symbolism, and various Eastern traditions to construct a synthetic framework that positioned Lemuria within a grand narrative of spiritual evolution. This eclectic approach allowed her to present seemingly disparate cultural traditions as remnants of a unified ancient wisdom that had originated in Lemuria and been transmitted through successive civilizations. The claimed source of Blavatsky's information about Lemuria and other esoteric matters was her correspondence with the Mahatmas, advanced spiritual beings who allegedly resided in remote Himalayan retreats and possessed direct knowledge of humanity's hidden history. These masters, as they were often called, supposedly transmitted information to Blavatsky through various psychic means, including materialized letters, telepathic communication, and out-of-body instruction during sleep states. The Mahatmas served as guarantors of authenticity for Blavatsky's teachings, providing divine authority that placed her revelations beyond conventional scholarly criticism. The most prominent of these alleged spiritual teachers was known as Master Morya, or simply M, described as a Rajput prince who had achieved advanced spiritual realization and dedicated himself to guiding humanity's evolution. Another key figure was Master Kuthumi, or KH, supposedly a Kashmiri Brahmin who possessed extensive knowledge of both Eastern philosophy and Western science. These beings allegedly coordinated their efforts to establish the Theosophical Society as a vehicle for disseminating ancient wisdom to the modern world, with Blavatsky serving as their primary representative in Western society. The letters allegedly received from these masters contained detailed information about Lemurian history, spiritual practices, and the cosmic laws governing planetary evolution. These communications described advanced technologies that the Lemurians had developed through their understanding of subtle energies, including methods for manipulating gravity, transmuting matter, and maintaining communication across dimensional boundaries. The masters claimed to be descendants of Lemurian adepts who had preserved this knowledge through successive incarnations, maintaining hidden schools where selected individuals could receive training in these ancient sciences. Blavatsky's presentation of this channeled information reflected the broader cultural context of late 19th century spiritualism, a movement that had gained considerable popularity following the American Civil War and various European social upheavals. The period witnessed widespread interest in communication with deceased individuals, psychic phenomena, and alternative religious frameworks that challenged conventional Christian doctrine. Spiritualist mediums claimed to receive messages from departed souls, while various occult societies explored ceremonial magic, astrology, and other esoteric practices that promised direct access to hidden knowledge. The scientific materialism that dominated academic institutions during this period created a reaction among individuals seeking spiritual meaning and purpose beyond purely mechanical explanations of existence. Darwin's evolutionary theory, while scientifically revolutionary, had undermined traditional religious accounts of human origins without providing satisfactory answers to questions about consciousness, purpose, and spiritual development. Blavatsky's synthesis offered an alternative framework that incorporated scientific terminology while maintaining space for spiritual evolution and cosmic meaning. The transformation of Lemuria from geological hypothesis to spiritual doctrine reflected broader changes in how esoteric traditions adapted to modern scientific discoveries. Rather than rejecting scientific findings outright, Blavatsky and other occultists of her era attempted to reinterpret these discoveries within expanded frameworks that accommodated both material and spiritual dimensions of reality. This approach allowed them to claim scientific credibility while advancing metaphysical propositions that exceeded the boundaries of empirical investigation. Blavatsky's use of scientific terminology and references to geological research lent apparent authority to her esoteric claims about Lemuria. She cited contemporary paleontological discoveries, geological surveys, and anthropological studies to support her assertions about ancient civilizations, though her interpretations of this evidence diverged dramatically from mainstream scientific conclusions. This selective appropriation of scientific findings became a characteristic feature of theosophical literature, creating hybrid texts that combined legitimate research with speculative metaphysical claims. The institutional framework that Blavatsky established through the Theosophical Society provided a vehicle for disseminating her Lemurian mythology to audiences throughout Europe and America. Founded in New York in 1875 with the stated objectives of promoting universal brotherhood, studying comparative religion, and investigating unexplained natural phenomena, the society attracted individuals who sought alternatives to both conventional religious doctrine and scientific materialism. The organization's international scope allowed Blavatsky's teachings to reach diverse cultural contexts where they would undergo further adaptation and elaboration. The elaborate civilization that Blavatsky described in her theosophical writings bore little resemblance to the modest scientific hypothesis that Sclatter had originally proposed. According to the secret doctrine and subsequent theosophical literature, the Lemurians represented humanity's first fully physical incarnation, emerging from purely spiritual beings into material forms that retained extraordinary psychic capabilities. These third-root race inhabitants possessed bodies fundamentally different from modern humans, characterized by enormous physical stature that Blavatsky claimed reached heights of 12 to 15 feet during the civilization's peak period. The physical characteristics attributed to the Lemurians reflected Blavatsky's synthesis of various esoteric traditions with contemporary anthropological speculation about human evolution. Early Lemurians allegedly possessed 4 arms, a feature that gradually disappeared as the race evolved toward more familiar human proportions. Their faces displayed distinctly non-human characteristics, with protruding jaws, widely spaced eyes, and cranial structures adapted to accommodate enlarged pineal glands that served as organs of psychic perception. The skin coloration varied according to geographical location, ranging from dark brown in tropical regions to lighter shades in temperate zones. Though all Lemurians shared certain distinctive physical markers that distinguished them from later human races. Most remarkably, according to theosophical doctrine, the Lemurians possessed a third eye located in the back of their heads, a physical manifestation of their enhanced psychic abilities. This organ supposedly provided direct perception of spiritual dimensions, allowing the Lemurians to see auras, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and maintain conscious contact with advanced beings from higher evolutionary planes. As the third root race progressed through its development cycle, this third eye gradually became internalized, transforming into the pineal gland that modern humans retain as a vestigial remnant of their Lemurian heritage. The reproductive methods attributed to the Lemurians departed dramatically from conventional biological processes. Early members of the third root race allegedly reproduced through a form of budding or spontaneous generation that required no sexual differentiation. As the civilization evolved, the Lemurians developed hermaphroditic characteristics, with individuals possessing both male and female reproductive organs. Only during the later phases of Lemurian development did sexual differentiation emerge, marking a crucial step in humanity's descent into material existence and the gradual loss of spiritual faculties. Theosophical texts described Lemurian society as organized according to strict hierarchical principles that reflected spiritual rather than political authority. The most evolved individuals, known as divine kings or sons of will and yoga, served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms, receiving direct guidance from cosmic intelligences and transmitting this wisdom to less advanced members of their communities. These spiritual leaders possessed the ability to manipulate matter through concentrated will, control weather patterns, and communicate with elemental forces that governed natural phenomena. The technological capabilities attributed to Lemurian civilization exceeded anything known to modern science, achieved through their understanding of subtle energies and psychic manipulation of matter. Rather than developing mechanical devices, the Lemurians allegedly created tools and structures through direct mental influence over atomic and molecular arrangements. Their cities featured massive stone buildings that were shaped through concentrated thought rather than physical construction, with architectural forms that defied conventional engineering principles by incorporating anti-gravitational elements and energy-focusing geometries. Transportation throughout Lemuria reportedly involved various forms of levitation and energy manipulation that eliminated the need for physical vehicles. Advanced Lemurians could travel vast distances by projecting their consciousness into different locations, while less developed individuals used crystalline devices that amplified their natural psychic abilities to achieve controlled flight. The continent's geography facilitated this transportation system, with natural energy currents flowing through specific pathways that the Lemurians learned to navigate using their enhanced perceptual abilities. The educational system in Lemurian society emphasized the development of psychic faculties rather than intellectual learning in the conventional sense. Children received instruction in consciousness manipulation, energy perception, and communication with non-physical beings from early ages. The curriculum included training in matter transmutation, weather control, and the cultivation of various supernatural abilities that modern humans would consider miraculous. Advanced students eventually gained access to mystery schools, where they learned to interact directly with the spiritual hierarchies that guided planetary evolution. Agricultural practices in Lemuria allegedly involved direct cooperation with nature spirits and elemental beings who assisted in crop cultivation and land management. The Lemurians understood the consciousness inherent in all natural phenomena and maintained harmonious relationships with the intelligence that animated plants, minerals, and atmospheric conditions. Their farming methods produced abundant harvests without depleting soil resources, as they worked with natural cycles and energy patterns, rather than imposing artificial modifications on the environment. The geographical extent of Lemuria, according to theosophical doctrine, encompassed a vast continental mass that stretched across much of what is now the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The continent's western boundaries included present-day Madagascar and portions of eastern Africa, while its eastern limits extended to include Australia, various Pacific islands, and parts of what would later become the Western Americas. The northern regions of Lemuria allegedly reached into areas now occupied by southern Asia, including portions of India, Southeast Asia, and the Indonesian archipelago. This massive landmass featured diverse climatic zones and geographical formations that supported different Lemurian populations with varying characteristics and developmental levels. The tropical central regions served as the civilization's primary cultural centers, where the most advanced spiritual schools and governmental institutions were located. Mountain ranges in the Northern Territories provided retreat locations for contemplative practices and advanced training in psychic abilities, while coastal areas facilitated communication with other continents and the exploration of oceanic regions. The relationship between Lemuria and Atlantis, according to Blavatsky's chronological framework, involved a complex transition period during which the third root race gradually gave way to the fourth root race. As Lemuria began its decline due to the spiritual degeneration of its inhabitants, groups of the most evolved Lemurians migrated to other continental areas where they established new civilizations. The most significant of these migrations led to the founding of Atlantis, which would become the homeland of the fourth root race and achieve even greater technological sophistication than its Lemurian predecessor. The timeline that theosophical literature established for Lemurian civilization placed its emergence approximately 18 million years ago, during geological periods that conventional science associates with the Miocene epoch. This chronology required dramatic revision of accepted anthropological and geological understanding, as it positioned advanced human civilization millions of years before the earliest known hominid fossils. Blavatsky justified this temporal framework by claiming that conventional science had failed to discover evidence of ancient civilizations due to cataclysmic geological changes that had destroyed most physical traces of prehistoric human development. The destruction of Lemuria allegedly occurred through a series of catastrophic events that unfolded over several million years, beginning with volcanic eruptions and seismic disturbances that gradually destabilized the continent's geological foundations. These natural disasters were interpreted as consequences of the Lemurian spiritual decline, as their misuse of psychic abilities and violation of cosmic laws attracted destructive forces that ultimately overwhelmed their technological defenses. The final submersion of the continent beneath ocean waters marked the end of the Third Root Race epoch and the beginning of humanity's next evolutionary phase. The survivors of Lemuria's destruction allegedly established refuge communities in various locations around the globe, where they preserved fragments of their ancient knowledge through secret mystery schools and initiatory traditions. These remnant populations supposedly influenced the development of later civilizations, including ancient Egypt, India, and various Native American cultures, transmitting architectural techniques, astronomical knowledge, and spiritual practices that originated in their Lemurian homeland. The megalithic structures found throughout the Pacific region were interpreted as evidence of this Lemurian influence, representing attempts by survivor communities to recreate the energy-focusing technologies of their lost continent. Theosophical doctrine attributed various modern human capabilities to genetic and spiritual inheritance from Lemurian ancestors, including intuitive abilities, artistic inspiration, and certain forms of psychic perception that occasionally manifest in sensitive individuals. The pineal gland was considered a vestigial remnant of the Lemurian third eye, while various meditation practices and consciousness expansion techniques were viewed as methods for reactivating dormant Lemurian faculties. This hereditary connection provided a framework for understanding human potential that exceeded the limitations imposed by purely materialistic interpretations of consciousness and mental ability. The influence of Lemurian civilization on subsequent human development allegedly extended beyond genetic inheritance to include the establishment of spiritual hierarchies that continued to guide planetary evolution from non-physical dimensions. The most advanced Lemurian adepts supposedly transcended physical existence entirely, becoming members of the Great White Brotherhood or hierarchy of masters, who work to assist humanity's continued spiritual development. These ascended beings maintained oversight of human affairs through incarnated representatives and psychic communication with sensitive individuals who could serve as channels for their guidance. The artistic and cultural achievements attributed to Lemurian civilization reflected their integration of spiritual perception with creative expression. Architecture, sculpture, and various decorative arts allegedly served as vehicles for encoding spiritual knowledge and focusing cosmic energies rather than merely aesthetic purposes. The Lemurians developed sophisticated understanding of color vibrations, sound frequencies, and geometric patterns that could influence consciousness and facilitate communication with non-physical realms. These artistic principles supposedly influenced later civilizations through the transmission of sacred geometry, musical scales, and symbolic systems that preserve fragments of Lemurian wisdom. The governmental structure of Lemurian society operated according to theocratic principles that recognized spiritual authority as the legitimate basis for political leadership. The most evolved individuals naturally assumed positions of responsibility due to their advanced psychic abilities and direct contact with guiding intelligences from higher evolutionary planes. This system eliminated the conflicts and corruption associated with competitive political processes, as leadership roles were determined by spiritual merit rather than personal ambition or popular appeal. While Helena Blavatsky's mystical interpretations of Lemuria captured the imagination of spiritualist communities worldwide, the scientific foundation upon which the original hypothesis rested began showing signs of structural weakness by the early 20th century. The emergence of new geological theories and improved understanding of Earth's crustal dynamics would eventually demolish the land bridge, explanations that had seemed so convincing to Victorian naturalists. This transformation began with the controversial work of Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist whose radical proposal about continental movement would initially face fierce resistance from the geological establishment before ultimately revolutionizing our understanding of planetary processes. Wegener's background in meteorology and astronomy provided him with a unique perspective on Earth's geological features that differed substantially from the training received by traditional geologists of his era. Born in Berlin in 1880, he had initially pursued studies in physics and astronomy before developing interests in polar research and atmospheric phenomena. His participation in expeditions to Greenland exposed him to large-scale geographical features and ice sheet dynamics that influenced his thinking about crustal movement and continental formation. The interdisciplinary nature of his scientific training allowed him to approach geological problems from angles that his contemporaries, confined within narrower specializations, might overlook. The observations that led Wegener to formulate his continental drift theory began accumulating during his examination of world maps and geological surveys in the early 1910s. The remarkable correspondence between the coastlines of South America and Africa had been noted by previous researchers, but most had dismissed this similarity as mere coincidence or attributed it to parallel erosional processes. Wegener recognized that the fit between these continental margins was too precise to result from random geological processes, particularly when combined with matching rock formations, fossil assemblages, and glacial deposits that appeared on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. His systematic investigation of these transoceanic correlations revealed patterns that extended far beyond the Africa-South America connection. Similar geological formations appeared in India, Antarctica, and Australia, while fossil remains of identical species were distributed across continents separated by vast ocean basins. The Glossopteris flora, an extinct group of seed plants, provided particularly compelling evidence for former continental connections, as these terrestrial organisms appeared in coal deposits throughout the southern hemisphere, despite the impossibility of their seeds crossing oceanic barriers through natural dispersal mechanisms. Wegener's continental drift hypothesis, first presented in a lecture to the German Geological Association in Frankfurt in January 1912, proposed that Earth's continents had once formed a single supercontinent that subsequently broke apart and drifted to their present positions. He named this primordial landmass Pangaea, meaning all earth in Greek, and suggested that its fragmentation had begun during the Mesozoic era, approximately 200 million years ago. The driving forces behind this continental movement remained unclear in Wegener's original formulation, though he speculated about tidal forces, centrifugal effects from Earth's rotation, and other mechanisms that might provide sufficient energy to move massive continental blocks. The publication of Die Entstehung der Kontinente und Ozeane in 1915 marked the formal introduction of continental drift theory to the international scientific community. Wegener's book presented extensive evidence for continental movement, including detailed maps showing how modern continents could be reassembled into Pangaea, comparative studies of rock formations across ocean basins, and analyses of fossil distributions that were impossible to explain through existing land bridge theories. His work challenged fundamental assumptions about Earth's geological stability that had dominated scientific thinking for centuries. The initial reception of Wegener's continental drift theory by the geological establishment was overwhelmingly negative, reflecting both legitimate scientific concerns and institutional resistance to paradigm-shifting ideas. Many geologists criticized the absence of a convincing mechanism for continental movement, arguing that the forces Wegener proposed were insufficient to overcome the resistance of solid rock and move entire continents across Earth's surface. The prevailing understanding of crustal composition suggested that continents were too firmly embedded in underlying rock layers to permit horizontal displacement on the scale that drift theory required. American geologists proved particularly hostile to continental drift, with prominent figures like Bailey Willis and Charles Schuchert leading systematic attacks on Wegener's hypothesis. They argued that the geological evidence could be explained more convincingly through existing theories involving land bridges, vertical crustal movements, and localized tectonic processes that did not require continental displacement. The American geological community's investment in land bridge explanations for biogeographical patterns made them especially resistant to alternatives that would require abandoning well-established theoretical frameworks. The resistance to continental drift also reflected broader patterns in early 20th century scientific culture, where established authorities often viewed revolutionary theories with suspicion and demanded extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Wegener's background as a meteorologist rather than a trained geologist made his geological pronouncements seem presumptuous to specialists who had devoted their careers to understanding crustal processes. The interdisciplinary nature of his evidence, drawing from paleontology, climatology, and biogeography, required expertise across multiple fields that few individual scientists possessed. Despite the hostile reception from geological authorities, Wegener continued developing his theory through successive editions of his book, incorporating new evidence and refining his arguments in response to criticisms. The 1922 English translation of the third German edition introduced continental drift to broader English-speaking audiences, though it failed to convert significant numbers of professional geologists to his position. The theory gained more favourable reception among biologists and paleontologists, who recognised its potential for explaining biogeographical patterns that had long puzzled researchers in their fields. The decades following Wegener's initial proposal witnessed sporadic support for continental drift, from scientists who recognised the explanatory power of his hypothesis, despite the absence of a convincing driving mechanism. Arthur Holmes, a British geologist with expertise in radiometric dating and thermal processes, suggested that convection currents in Earth's mantle might provide the energy necessary for continental movement. His proposals about mantle convection anticipated later developments in plate tectonic theory, though the geophysical evidence needed to support such mechanisms remained unavailable during the 1920s and 1930s. The development of new technologies and research methods during and after World War II began providing the observational tools necessary for testing continental drift theory through direct measurement of geological processes. Advances in seismology, ocean floor mapping, and magnetic field detection created opportunities for investigating Earth's internal structure and crustal dynamics with unprecedented precision. Military requirements for submarine warfare and navigation systems drove improvements in sonar technology that would eventually reveal the detailed topography of ocean floors and the geological processes operating along mid-oceanic ridges. The systematic mapping of ocean floors during the 1950s revealed geological features that existing theories could not adequately explain. The discovery of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range running down the centre of the Atlantic Ocean, suggested active geological processes operating along oceanic boundaries. Similar ridge systems were identified in other ocean basins, creating a global network of underwater mountain ranges that appear to be sites of ongoing volcanic activity and crustal formation. Marie Tharp and Bruce Heesen's detailed mapping of the Atlantic Ocean floor revealed that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge featured a central rift valley where new oceanic crust was apparently being created through volcanic processes. This discovery suggested that ocean basins were not permanent features but dynamic systems, where new material was continuously being added along central ridges. The implications of this seafloor spreading process extended far beyond oceanography, providing a potential mechanism for the continental movement that Wegener had proposed decades earlier. The paleomagnetic research conducted by scientists like Stanley Keith Runcorn and Edward Irving during the 1950s provided additional evidence for continental movement through studies of ancient magnetic field orientations preserved in rock formations. These investigations revealed that the apparent positions of Earth's magnetic poles had changed dramatically over geological time, though this could be explained either by polar wandering or continental drift. When paleomagnetic data from different continents were compared, they showed divergent polar wandering paths that could only be reconciled if the continents themselves had moved relative to each other. Harry Hess's hypothesis of seafloor spreading, presented in his influential 1962 paper History of Ocean Basins, synthesized the growing body of evidence for oceanic crustal formation with continental drift theory to propose a comprehensive model of crustal dynamics. Hess suggested that new oceanic crust was created at mid-oceanic ridges through volcanic processes and subsequently moved away from these spreading centres as additional material was added. This conveyor belt mechanism provided the driving force for continental movement that had been missing from Wegener's original formulation. The confirmation of seafloor spreading through magnetic stripe patterns discovered by Frederick Vine and Drummond Matthews in 1963 provided decisive evidence for crustal movement and validated the basic principles of continental drift theory. Their analysis of magnetic anomalies in oceanic crust revealed symmetrical patterns on either side of mid-oceanic ridges that recorded reversals in Earth's magnetic field over geological time. These magnetic stripes demonstrated that oceanic crust was indeed moving away from spreading centres at measurable rates, providing quantitative support for the seafloor spreading hypothesis. The integration of seafloor spreading, continental drift, and transform fault systems into the comprehensive theory of plate tectonics occurred during the mid-1960s through the work of scientists like Jason Morgan, Dan McKenzie, and Xavier Le Pichoin. This new theoretical framework explained Earth's surface as composed of large, rigid plates that moved relative to each other through processes of creation at mid-oceanic ridges, destruction at subduction zones, and lateral sliding along transform faults. Plate tectonic theory provided quantitative predictions about crustal movement that could be tested through direct measurement and geological observation. The acceptance of plate tectonics by the geological community during the late 1960s represented one of the most rapid paradigm shifts in the history of earth sciences. The theory's ability to explain diverse geological phenomena, from earthquake distribution to mountain building processes, convinced most researchers that the basic principles of continental drift were correct despite earlier skepticism. This transformation vindicated Wegener's original insights while providing the mechanistic understanding that his critics had demanded. The implications of plate tectonic theory for biogeographical explanations extended far beyond the specific case of lemur distribution that had originally motivated Sclatter's Lemuria hypothesis. The recognition that continents had moved substantial distances over geological time provided a natural explanation for the distribution of related species across ocean basins without requiring land bridge connections. India's collision with Asia, Africa's separation from South America, and the breakup of Gondwana created the geographical patterns observed in modern biogeography through continental movement rather than sunken land bridges. The scientific abandonment of the Lemuria hypothesis occurred gradually as plate tectonic theory gained acceptance and provided superior explanations for the biogeographical patterns that had originally motivated land bridge proposals. The recognition that India had been an isolated continent that drifted northward from Gondwana before colliding with Asia explained the presence of lemur fossils in Indian geological formations without requiring a land bridge connection to Madagascar. The evolutionary divergence of lemur populations could be understood as a consequence of geographical isolation following continental separation rather than submersion of connecting land masses. Modern understanding of lemur biogeography incorporates plate tectonic history with evolutionary biology to explain current distribution patterns through a combination of continental drift, island biogeography, and evolutionary adaptation. Madagascar's separation from Africa approximately 160 million years ago, followed by its isolation from India around 90 million years ago, created the geographical conditions for lemur evolution in isolation from competing primate groups. The absence of anthropoid primates on Madagascar allowed lemurs to diversify into ecological niches that were occupied by monkeys and apes on other continents. The persistence of Lemuria in popular culture and alternative spiritual movements, despite its scientific refutation, illustrates the complex relationship between scientific knowledge and cultural mythology. While professional geologists and biogeographers had abandoned land bridge explanations by the 1970s, Theosophical and New Age communities continued promoting Lemurian concepts that bore little resemblance to the original scientific hypothesis. This divergence created parallel narratives about Lemuria that operated in completely different intellectual frameworks, with scientific and mystical versions of the concept developing independently without meaningful interaction. The transformation of Lemuria from scientific hypothesis to cultural myth reflects broader patterns in how discredited scientific ideas persist in popular consciousness long after their abandonment by professional researchers. The romantic appeal of lost civilizations, combined with the complexity of plate tectonic theory, allowed simplified versions of land bridge concepts to survive in non-scientific contexts where empirical evidence carried less weight than imaginative speculation. The scientific precision required for understanding continental drift and biogeographical processes made these explanations less accessible to general audiences than the dramatic narratives of sunken continents and ancient civilizations. The rejection of Lemuria by mainstream science did nothing to diminish its appeal in popular imagination, where the concept underwent a remarkable transformation from discredited geological hypothesis into one of the most enduring mythological frameworks of the 20th century. The gap between scientific abandonment and cultural persistence created fertile ground for writers, filmmakers, and spiritual teachers who found in Lemuria a canvas for projecting contemporary anxieties, utopian dreams, and alternative historical narratives that challenge conventional understanding of human civilization. James Churchward emerged as the most influential popularizer of lost continent mythology during the 1920s, though his focus shifted from Blavatsky's Lemuria to an entirely different Pacific civilization he called Mu. Born in England in 1851, Churchward claimed extensive travel experience throughout Asia and the Pacific, including alleged service as a British Army officer in India, where he purportedly discovered ancient tablets revealing the existence of a vast Pacific continent. His background combined elements of colonial military service, amateur archaeology, and mystical speculation that reflected the cultural milieu of late Victorian imperialism and its fascination with ancient Eastern wisdom. Churchward's first major work, The Lost Continent of Mu, published in 1926, established the foundation for what would become a 5-book series that dramatically expanded upon theosophical concepts, while departing significantly from Blavatsky's specific formulations. Where Blavatsky had positioned Lemuria as the homeland of the third root race within a complex cosmological framework, Churchward presented Mu as a historical civilization that had achieved remarkable technological and cultural sophistication before its destruction approximately 12,000 years ago. His approach emphasized archaeological evidence and linguistic analysis rather than channeled communications from spiritual masters, lending apparent scholarly credibility to his extraordinary claims. The geographical scope of Churchward's Mu dwarfed even Blavatsky's expanded Lemuria, encompassing virtually the entire Pacific Ocean from the coasts of Asia to the Americas. According to his reconstruction, this massive continent had supported a population of 64 million inhabitants, organized into 10 tribes under the rule of a priest-king called Ramu. The civilization's capital city, also named Mu, featured magnificent temples, universities, and technological facilities that surpassed anything achieved by known ancient civilizations. Churchward described elaborate irrigation systems, sophisticated metallurgy, and architectural achievements that demonstrated advanced engineering knowledge. The source materials that Churchward claimed to have discovered included ancient tablets written in a mysterious script called Narkal, which he alleged had been preserved in Tibetan monasteries and Indian temples. These documents supposedly contained the complete history of Mu, including detailed accounts of its government, religion, technology, and eventual destruction. Churchward presented himself as the first Western scholar to decode this ancient writing system, though he provided no photographs or independent verification of the tablet's existence. His translations revealed a civilization that had achieved remarkable cultural unity across its vast territorial extent, with standardized languages, religious practices, and technological systems. The religious framework that Churchward attributed to Mu emphasized monotheistic worship of supreme deity, represented by various symbolic forms throughout the continent's sacred architecture. This theological system allegedly influenced all subsequent world religions, with Egyptian, Hindu, Greek, and Judeo-Christian traditions, preserving fragments of original Muian beliefs through their mythologies and ceremonial practices. Churchward's analysis of religious symbolism attempted to demonstrate these connections through comparative studies of sacred geometry, astronomical alignments, and ritual procedures that he claimed originated in Mu's temple schools. The technological capabilities that Churchward described for Muian civilization included advanced metallurgy, precision stone cutting, and sophisticated understanding of engineering principles that enabled the construction of massive monuments and urban infrastructure. The inhabitants allegedly developed methods for working with extremely hard stones, using tools and techniques that left no archaeological traces, explaining the absence of material evidence for their existence. Their architectural achievements included pyramids, temples, and ceremonial complexes that served as models for similar structures built by later civilization throughout the world. The destruction of Mu, according to Churchward's narrative, resulted from catastrophic volcanic eruptions and seismic activity that caused the continent to sink beneath the Pacific Ocean in a matter of days. Survivors of this cataclysm supposedly migrated to various parts of the world, carrying with them fragments of Muian knowledge that influenced the development of subsequent civilizations. These refugee populations allegedly established colonies in Egypt, India, Central America, and other regions where they transmitted architectural techniques, astronomical knowledge, and religious practices that originated in their Pacific homeland. Churchward's conflation of Lemuria and Mu created considerable confusion in popular literature, as many subsequent writers used the terms interchangeably or combined elements from both traditions into hybrid narratives. This synthesis reflected the fluid nature of lost continent mythology, where different authors felt free to modify, expand, or reinterpret existing frameworks according to their own creative or ideological purposes. The lack of empirical constraints on these speculative histories allowed for unlimited elaboration and variation, creating a diverse literature that shared common themes while diverging significantly in specific details. The incorporation of lost continent themes into science fiction literature began during the pulp magazine era of the 1920s and 1930s, when writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft discovered in Lemuria and Mu-rich sources of exotic settings for adventure stories and fantasy narratives. These authors transform the mystical civilizations described by Blavatsky and Churchward into dramatic backdrops for tales of heroic exploration, ancient conflicts, and supernatural encounters that appeal to readers seeking escapist entertainment during the economic hardships of the Depression era. Edgar Rice Burroughs, already famous for his Tarzan and John Carter of Mars series, incorporated Lemurian themes into several novels that featured explorers discovering remnant populations of ancient Pacific civilizations. His 1929 novel Tanar of Pellucidar included references to a lost continent whose survivors had established underground cities accessible through polar openings. Burroughs' treatment emphasized adventure and romance rather than spiritual philosophy, transforming Lemuria from a vehicle for esoteric teaching into a setting for thrilling escapades involving primitive tribes, advanced technology, and exotic landscapes. Robert E. Howard's contributions to Lost Continent literature appeared primarily in his Conan stories and other sword and sorcery tales that featured ancient civilizations with supernatural elements. Howard's Hyborian Age included several nations and empires that drew inspiration from theosophical descriptions of Lemuria and Atlantis, though he adapted these sources to fit his own dark fantasy aesthetic. His stories emphasized violent conflict, barbaric splendor, and the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations, rather than spiritual evolution or cosmic consciousness, reflecting his pessimistic worldview and fascination with historical cycles of cultural development. H.P. Lovecraft's approach to Lost Continent mythology proved more sophisticated and influential than his pulp fiction contemporaries, incorporating Lemurian themes into his broader cosmological framework known as the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraft's fictional Pacific continent of R'lyeh drew obvious inspiration from theosophical descriptions of sunken Lemuria, while serving as the prison tomb for the alien entity Cthulhu. His stories suggested that ancient civilizations had possessed knowledge of cosmic forces that exceeded human comprehension, creating a sense of existential dread rather than romantic adventure. Lovecraft's treatment of lost continents emphasized their alien nature and the dangerous consequences of rediscovering their secrets. The influence of these pulp fiction adaptations extended far beyond their original readership, establishing narrative conventions and thematic patterns that would shape subsequent treatments of Lemuria in popular culture. The transformation of mystical spiritual evolution into adventure stories, the emphasis on technological rather than psychic achievements, and the dramatic potential of catastrophic destruction became standard elements in Lost Continent fiction. These literary developments created a parallel tradition of Lemurian mythology that operated independently from its theosophical origins while drawing upon similar sources of cultural fascination with ancient mysteries. Hollywood's discovery of Lost Continent themes occurred during the 1930s and 1940s, when film studios recognized the visual and dramatic potential of stories featuring exotic ancient civilizations, catastrophic destruction, and heroic exploration. The technical capabilities of early cinema, particularly in the realm of special effects and set design, made Lost Continents attractive subjects for spectacular productions that could showcase studio craftsmanship while appealing to audiences hungry for escapist entertainment during wartime and economic uncertainty. The 1935 film She, directed by Irving Pickle and Lansing C. Holden, though based on H. Rider Haggard's novel rather than explicitly Lemurian sources, established many of the visual conventions that would characterize subsequent Lost Civilization films. The movie featured elaborate sets depicting ancient temples, underground cities, and advanced technologies preserved from prehistoric times. The production design emphasized exotic architecture, mysterious rituals, and the contrast between primitive and advanced elements within the same civilization, creating a visual vocabulary that later films would adapt for specifically Lemurian settings. The 1951 film Unknown World incorporated elements clearly derived from theosophical descriptions of Lemuria, featuring explorers who discover an advanced underground civilization populated by survivors of an ancient catastrophe. The movie's scientific framework attempted to provide rational explanations for the existence of such hidden populations, reflecting the influence of atomic age anxieties about technological advancement and civilizational survival. The underground setting allowed filmmakers to create elaborate sets, suggesting advanced technology while maintaining the mystery and isolation that made lost civilizations dramatically compelling. Television's treatment of Lemurian themes began during the 1950s with anthology series like Science Fiction Theatre and Tales of Tomorrow, which occasionally featured episodes involving lost continents and ancient civilizations. These productions typically adapted elements from pulp fiction sources rather than engaging directly with theosophical literature, emphasizing scientific speculation and adventure rather than spiritual philosophy. The episodic format of television encouraged simplified treatments that could introduce and resolve lost continent mysteries within single episodes, leading to formulaic approaches that reduced complex mythologies to basic adventure frameworks. The role of popular media in perpetuating and evolving Lemurian mythology throughout the 20th century involved a complex process of cultural transmission, adaptation, and reinvention that operated largely independently from both scientific understanding and original theosophical teachings. Each medium, literature, film, television, and later digital media, imposed its own constraints and opportunities that shaped how Lemurian themes were presented to mass audiences. The commercial requirements of entertainment industries favoured dramatic, accessible versions of lost continent stories over the complex philosophical frameworks that had originally motivated theosophical interest in ancient civilizations. The persistence of Lemurian themes in popular culture reflected deeper cultural currents related to modernity, technology, and spiritual seeking that transcended specific historical periods. The 20th century's rapid technological advancement created both fascination with ancient achievements and anxiety about civilizational fragility, making stories about advanced lost civilizations particularly resonant for audiences experiencing unprecedented social change. Lemuria provided a framework for exploring questions about human potential, technological responsibility, and the relationship between material and spiritual development that remained relevant across different decades and cultural contexts. The evolution of Lemurian mythology in popular media also demonstrated the fluid nature of cultural transmission, where ideas originating in specific intellectual contexts could be adapted, modified, and reinterpreted to serve entirely different purposes. The transformation of Blavatsky's spiritual teachings into adventure fiction, Churchward's archaeological claims into science fiction scenarios, and theosophical cosmology into Hollywood spectacle illustrated how cultural materials could migrate across boundaries of genre, medium, and intellectual framework while maintaining recognizable core elements. The commercial success of Lemurian themes in various media formats encouraged continued production of related content, creating feedback loops that sustained interest in lost continent mythology long after its scientific foundations had been thoroughly discredited. Publishers, filmmakers, and television producers recognized that audiences remained fascinated by stories involving ancient mysteries, advanced lost civilizations, and catastrophic destruction, leading to ongoing investment in content that drew upon these themes. This commercial incentive helped maintain Lemurian concepts in public consciousness, even as academic scholarship moved toward entirely different explanations for the biogeographical and geological phenomena that had originally motivated land bridge theories. The persistence of Lemurian mythology in popular consciousness created a fertile environment for the misinterpretation of legitimate archaeological discoveries, as enthusiasts sought physical evidence to validate their beliefs about the lost continent. This phenomenon intensified during the latter half of the 20th century, when improved transportation and communication technologies made remote archaeological sites more accessible to amateur researchers and alternative history proponents. The resulting wave of pseudoscientific claims transformed genuine archaeological mysteries into supposed proof of Lemurian civilization, demonstrating how preconceived beliefs could fundamentally distort the interpretation of material evidence. Easter Island, known to its Polynesian inhabitants as Rapa Nui, became perhaps the most frequently cited example of alleged Lemurian architecture, despite overwhelming evidence for its Polynesian origins. The island's famous Moai statues, nearly 900 monolithic human figures carved from volcanic tuff between approximately 1250 and 1500 AD, were reinterpreted by Lemurian enthusiasts as remnants of the lost continent's advanced stoneworking technology. Proponents of this theory pointed to the statue's massive size, with the largest completed Moai reaching heights of nearly 33 feet and weighing up to 82 tons as evidence of capabilities that exceeded those of known Polynesian cultures. The actual archaeological record of Easter Island reveals a sophisticated but entirely human achievement by Polynesian settlers who arrived sometime between 700 and 1200 AD. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials associated with statue construction, analysis of tool marks on the Moai, and examination of the quarry sites at Rano-Raraku demonstrate a clear progression of carving techniques that developed over several centuries. The statues were created using stone tools made from harder basalt, with evidence of the entire production process preserved in archaeological deposits around the quarry sites. The transportation methods employed by the Rapa Nui people involved sophisticated understanding of leverage, rolling techniques, and coordinated labour organisation that required no supernatural or lost civilization explanations. The misattribution of Easter Island's achievements to Lemurian influence reflected a broader pattern of cultural chauvinism that denied indigenous populations credit for their own accomplishments. European and American researchers, influenced by colonial attitudes about Pacific Islander capabilities, found it easier to attribute impressive archaeological remains to hypothetical advanced civilizations, rather than acknowledge the sophisticated engineering and organizational skills of Polynesian societies. This bias was particularly evident in early 20th century archaeological literature, where writers consistently underestimated the technological capabilities and cultural achievements of non-European populations. Nan Madol, the remarkable stone city built on artificial islands off the coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia, provided another target for Lemurian misinterpretation despite clear evidence of its construction by the Sodelur dynasty between approximately 1200 and 1700 AD. The site consists of nearly 100 artificial islets, created from massive basalt columns and filled coral platforms, connected by a network of canals that earned it the nickname Venice of the Pacific. Lemurian proponents seized upon the monument's impressive scale and sophisticated engineering as evidence of lost continent technology, particularly focusing on the transportation and placement of basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons. Archaeological investigation of Nan Madol has revealed extensive evidence for its construction by indigenous Micronesian populations using techniques that, while impressive, fall well within the range of documented Pacific Islander capabilities. The basalt columns were quarried from nearby Soke's rock, using fire-setting techniques to create natural fracture lines, then transported to the construction site using wooden rollers, lever systems, and coordinated human labour. Oral traditions preserved by Pohnpeian communities provide detailed accounts of the construction process, including the organisation of labour gangs, the seasonal timing of building campaigns, and the political motivations behind the project's massive scale. The dating evidence for Nan Madol's construction comes from multiple independent sources, including radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in construction fills, thermoluminescence dating of ceramics associated with building phases, and stratigraphic analysis of architectural sequences. This chronological framework places the site's development firmly within the historical period of Micronesian cultural development, with no gaps or anomalies that would suggest intervention by external civilizations. The architectural techniques employed at Nan Madol show clear continuity with other Micronesian stone construction traditions, demonstrating technological development through local innovation rather than foreign influence. Indian temple architecture, particularly the massive stone structures found at sites like Hampi, Konark and the Ellora caves, became frequent targets for Lemurian misattribution, despite extensive documentation of their historical construction by known Indian dynasties. The Kailasa temple at Ellora, carved from a single piece of rock during the 8th century AD under the patronage of the Rashtrakuta dynasty, was particularly susceptible to alternative interpretations due to its extraordinary scale and precision. Lemurian enthusiasts pointed to the temple's monolithic construction, intricate sculptural details, and sophisticated architectural planning as evidence of lost continent technology preserved through secret knowledge traditions. The historical record for Indian temple construction provides exhaustive documentation of the techniques, patronage systems, and cultural contexts that produced these remarkable monuments. Inscriptional evidence from temple walls, contemporary literary sources, and archaeological analysis of construction sequences demonstrate clear continuity with established Indian architectural traditions. The tools and techniques employed in temple construction, including iron chisels, wooden scaffolding systems, and sophisticated geometric planning methods, are well documented in Sanskrit technical treatises like the Maya Mata and Manasara, which provide detailed instructions for architectural design and construction. The misinterpretation of Indian temple architecture as Lemurian in origin reflected fundamental misunderstandings about the sophistication and antiquity of Indian civilization. Western researchers, influenced by colonial-era assumptions about Asian cultural capabilities, often attributed impressive architectural achievements to hypothetical external influences, rather than recognizing the indigenous development of advanced engineering and artistic traditions. This bias was particularly pronounced in alternative archaeology literature, where writers consistently ignored or dismissed the extensive historical documentation available for Indian architectural development. The phenomenon of Lemurian artifact claims emerged during the 1960s and 1970s, when various individuals began presenting objects allegedly recovered from underwater sites, remote caves, or private collections as physical evidence for the lost continent's existence. These artifacts typically consisted of carved stones, metal objects, or crystal formations that their discoverers claimed showed technological sophistication or artistic styles inconsistent with known ancient civilizations. The absence of proper archaeological context for these discoveries, combined with their convenient alignment with Lemurian mythology, raised immediate red flags among professional archaeologists. The most notorious example of alleged Lemurian artifacts involved the Burroughs Cave collection, a key assemblage of carved stones claimed to have been discovered in an Illinois cave during the 1980s by Russell Burroughs. The stones featured a mixture of supposed ancient scripts, including claimed Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hebrew letters, and various symbols that Burroughs and his supporters interpreted as evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and Old World civilizations. Some enthusiasts went further, suggesting that the cave represented a repository of Lemurian knowledge preserved by survivors of the lost continent's destruction. Professional archaeological analysis of the Burroughs cave materials revealed numerous indicators of modern fabrication, including tool marks consistent with contemporary carving implements, artificial aging techniques, and anachronistic combinations of supposedly ancient scripts. The alleged discovery site was never made available for independent archaeological investigation, while the circumstances surrounding the stone's discovery changed repeatedly in different accounts provided by Burroughs. The absence of any organic materials suitable for radiocarbon dating, combined with the refusal to allow scientific testing of the stones themselves, eliminated any possibility of authenticating the collection through standard archaeological methods. Similar patterns characterized other alleged Lemurian artifact discoveries, including the Michigan relics of the late 19th century, various crystal skulls claimed to possess ancient origins, and metal objects supposedly recovered from Pacific Ocean depths. In each case, professional archaeological analysis revealed evidence of modern manufacture, while the discovery circumstances involved significant gaps in documentation, chain of custody problems, or refusal to permit scientific testing. The consistent absence of proper archaeological context for these discoveries reflected the fundamental difference between legitimate archaeological investigation and artifact hunting motivated by preconceived beliefs about ancient civilizations. The role of confirmation bias in interpreting archaeological discoveries through a Lemurian lens became particularly evident in the treatment of genuine archaeological mysteries that lacked complete explanations within current scholarly understanding. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Pumapunku in Bolivia, and various megalithic structures throughout the Pacific region provided opportunities for alternative researchers to insert Lemurian explanations into gaps in archaeological knowledge. The tendency to interpret unexplained features as evidence for lost civilizations reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how archaeological knowledge develops through gradual accumulation of evidence rather than complete explanatory frameworks. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in southeastern Turkey during the 1990s and subsequently excavated by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, presented genuine puzzles about the organizational capabilities of hunter-gatherer societies during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. The site's massive stone pillars, sophisticated relief carvings, and complex architectural planning appeared to exceed the expected capabilities of non-agricultural populations, leading some researchers to reconsider assumptions about social organization during the transition to farming. Lemurian enthusiasts seized upon these interpretive challenges as evidence for advanced lost civilization influence, despite the site's clear context within regional Neolithic development. The archaeological investigation of Göbekli Tepe revealed extensive evidence for its construction by local populations, using techniques that, while impressive for their time period, required no external technological input. The stoneworking methods employed at the site involved percussion flaking, grinding, and polishing techniques documented at numerous other Neolithic sites throughout the region. The organizational requirements for the monument's construction, while substantial, fell within the range of capabilities demonstrated by other complex hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Pacific Northwest Coast cultures that created elaborate ceremonial architecture without agricultural foundations. Pumapunku, part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological complex in Bolivia, became another frequent target for Lemurian misinterpretation due to its precision-fitted stone construction and sophisticated architectural planning. The site's massive andesite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, were shaped with remarkable precision and assembled without mortar into complex architectural forms. Lemurian proponents pointed to the precision of the stone cutting, the sophistication of the joinery techniques, and the monument's astronomical alignments as evidence of lost continent technology preserved in Andean highland cultures. Archaeological research at Pumapunku has documented the entire sequence of its construction by the Tiwanaku civilization between approximately 500 and 1000 AD, using techniques that represented the culmination of centuries of Andean architectural development. The precision stone cutting was achieved through careful selection of raw materials, sophisticated understanding of stone properties, and patient application of grinding and polishing techniques using harder stone tools. The transportation of massive blocks from distant quarries involved elaborate ramp systems, wooden rollers, and coordinated labour organisation that drew upon the Tiwanaku state's substantial population and administrative capabilities. The astronomical alignments incorporated into Pumapunku's design reflected sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that developed through centuries of observation and mathematical analysis by Andean astronomers. These achievements represented the culmination of indigenous knowledge traditions rather than external influence, with clear continuity between Tiwanaku astronomical practices and those documented among later Andean civilizations. The tendency to attribute such accomplishments to hypothetical lost civilizations reflected persistent underestimation of indigenous intellectual and technological capabilities. The distinction between legitimate archaeological mysteries and unfounded Lemurian connections requires careful attention to the standards of evidence and methodology that characterize professional archaeological research. Genuine archaeological puzzles typically involve specific technical questions about construction methods, organizational requirements, or cultural context that can be addressed through continued investigation and analysis. These mysteries exist within broader frameworks of understanding about regional cultural development and represent gaps in knowledge rather than fundamental contradictions of established historical sequences. Unfounded Lemurian connections, by contrast, typically involve wholesale rejection of established archaeological chronologies, dismissal of documented cultural contexts, and attribution of impressive achievements to hypothetical civilizations for which no independent evidence exists. The proponents of such connections consistently ignore the extensive archaeological evidence for indigenous cultural development, while focusing selectively on features that appear anomalous when removed from their proper historical contexts. This approach reflects fundamental misunderstanding of how archaeological knowledge develops through systematic investigation, rather than speculative interpretation of isolated phenomena. The persistence of archaeological misinterpretations in Lemurian literature demonstrates the powerful influence of preconceived beliefs on the evaluation of evidence. Individuals committed to the existence of lost continents consistently interpret ambiguous archaeological data in ways that support their beliefs while dismissing or ignoring contradictory evidence. This confirmation bias operates through selective citation of sources, misrepresentation of archaeological findings, and failure to engage with the full body of evidence relevant to specific sites or artifacts. The proliferation of alternative archaeology literature during the late 20th century created echo chambers where Lemurian interpretations could circulate without serious critical evaluation. Publishers specializing in alternative history topics found profitable markets for books that promised to reveal hidden truths about ancient civilizations, leading to the production of numerous volumes that recycled and elaborated upon earlier Lemurian claims without subjecting them to rigorous analysis. The commercial success of such publications encouraged continued production of similar content, creating self-reinforcing cycles that sustained interest in discredited theories. The impact of internet technologies on the dissemination of Lemurian archaeological claims created new opportunities for the rapid spread of misinformation, while simultaneously making legitimate archaeological research more accessible to interested audiences. Websites, forums, and social media platforms allowed enthusiasts to share alleged discoveries, coordinate research efforts, and build communities around shared beliefs about lost civilizations. The democratic nature of internet communication eliminated traditional gatekeeping mechanisms that had previously limited the circulation of unsubstantiated claims, while the visual nature of online media made impressive archaeological photographs powerful tools for supporting alternative interpretations. The counterculture revolution of the 1960s created unprecedented conditions for the resurrection of esoteric traditions that had languished on the margins of Western society since the early 20th century. As young Americans and Europeans rejected conventional religious institutions and sought alternative spiritual frameworks, the mystical teachings of Helena Blavatsky and her theosophical successors experienced a remarkable renaissance. Lemuria emerged from decades of relative obscurity to become a central organizing principle for the diverse collection of beliefs, practices, and communities that would eventually coalesce into the New Age movement. The social upheavals of the Vietnam War era, combined with widespread experimentation with psychedelic substances and Eastern spiritual practices, created a cultural environment where claims about ancient lost civilizations seemed not only plausible but urgently relevant. The civil rights movement, environmental activism, and feminist consciousness raising had already challenged established authorities and conventional historical narratives, making audiences more receptive to alternative accounts of human development that positioned indigenous wisdom traditions as superior to Western technological civilization. Within this context, Lemuria offered a compelling mythology that validated both spiritual seeking and criticism of modern materialism. The publication of books like The Morning of the Magicians by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier in 1960 introduced French audiences to a synthesis of occult traditions, alternative archaeology, and speculative science that would profoundly influence Anglophone New Age literature. The authors presented Lemuria alongside other lost civilizations as evidence for cyclical patterns of human development that included periods of advanced spiritual and technological achievement, followed by catastrophic decline. Their approach emphasized the practical applications of ancient knowledge, rather than purely mystical speculation, suggesting that modern researchers could recover and apply Lemurian wisdom to address contemporary problems. American readers encountered similar ideas through the work of writers like Frank Waters, whose 1963 book, The Book of the Hopi, presented Native American oral traditions as preserving memories of ancient catastrophes and lost continents. Waters claimed that Hopi prophecies described the destruction of previous worlds, including a Pacific continent that corresponded to theosophical descriptions of Lemuria. His interpretation of indigenous traditions through the lens of lost continent mythology reflected broader New Age tendencies to appropriate elements from diverse cultural traditions while fitting them into predetermined esoteric frameworks. The emergence of channeled communications claiming contact with Lemurian spirits or ascended masters represented perhaps the most distinctive feature of the New Age revival, transforming Blavatsky's claimed correspondence with Himalayan adepts into a widespread practice involving hundreds of individuals who reported receiving messages from ancient sources. These modern channelers typically described their Lemurian contacts as highly evolved beings who had transcended physical death and remained available to provide guidance for humanity's current spiritual evolution. The messages they transmitted combined traditional theosophical themes with contemporary concerns about nuclear war, environmental destruction, and social transformation. J.Z. Knight emerged as one of the most prominent and controversial figures in the channeled communications phenomenon, claiming since 1977 to serve as a medium for an entity called Ramtha, who identified himself as a 35000-year-old warrior from Lemuria. Knight's Ramtha sessions, conducted before audiences that sometimes numbered in the thousands, presented elaborate accounts of Lemurian civilization that expanded significantly upon Blavatsky's original descriptions. According to these communications, Ramtha had lived during Lemuria's final period and witnessed the continent's destruction before ascending to a higher dimensional plane from which he could observe and influence human development. The Ramtha material described Lemurian society as organized around the principle of individual sovereignty, with each person recognized as a divine being capable of creating their own reality through focused intention and emotional mastery. This teaching resonated strongly with 1970s and 1980s audiences who had embraced human potential psychology, consciousness expansion techniques, and various forms of personal empowerment training. The Lemurian framework provided historical precedent and spiritual authority for contemporary beliefs about unlimited human potential and the power of consciousness to shape material reality. Knight's presentations incorporated elements of performance art, motivational speaking, and religious revival meetings, with Ramtha delivering messages in an archaic speaking style that combined pseudo-Elizabethan grammar with contemporary self-help terminology. The entity claimed to have fought against Atlantean oppression during Lemuria's final centuries, eventually leading his people to freedom before achieving enlightenment and transcending physical existence. These dramatic narratives provided compelling backstories for spiritual teachings that might otherwise have seemed abstract or impersonal to modern audiences seeking both wisdom and entertainment. The commercial success of Knight's Ramtha School of Enlightenment, established in rural Washington state during the 1980s, demonstrated the economic potential of channeled Lemurian teachings while creating a model that numerous other channelers would adapt for their own purposes. The school combined residential workshops, ongoing classes, and retreat programs that attracted students from around the world who were willing to pay substantial fees for access to alleged ancient wisdom. The curriculum included meditation techniques, consciousness expansion exercises, and various practices supposedly derived from Lemurian spiritual traditions. Other prominent channelers of the period claimed contact with different Lemurian entities, creating a diverse landscape of competing revelations that shared common themes while differing significantly in specific details. Penny Torres channeled an entity called Mafu, who claimed to be a Lemurian high priest, while Kevin Ryerson reported communications with various ancient sources, including Lemurian spiritual teachers. These channelers typically presented their entities as members of an organized spiritual hierarchy that had guided human evolution since Lemuria's destruction, working to assist contemporary humanity's transition into a new age of expanded consciousness. The integration of Lemurian themes with crystal healing practices reflected the New Age movement's tendency to combine ancient spiritual concepts with contemporary alternative health approaches. Practitioners claim that certain crystals, particularly those found in specific geographical locations, retained energetic imprints from Lemurian civilization and could be used to access ancient healing knowledge or enhance psychic abilities. Quartz crystals became especially important in this context, with healers asserting that Lemurians had programmed these stones with beneficial vibrations that remained accessible to sensitive individuals. The development of elaborate crystal healing systems during the 1980s drew heavily upon claimed Lemurian precedents, with practitioners asserting that their techniques represented recovered fragments of advanced healing sciences that had been lost during the continent's destruction. These systems typically involved placing crystals on specific points of the human body, creating geometric patterns with multiple stones, or using crystals to focus healing intentions during meditation or energy work sessions. The theoretical framework supporting these practices combined elements of traditional Chinese medicine, Hindu chakra systems, and speculative physics that positioned crystals as sophisticated technological devices rather than simple mineral formations. Katrina Raphael emerged as one of the most influential figures in crystal healing literature, publishing a series of books beginning with Crystal Enlightenment in 1985 that presented comprehensive systems for working with crystals based on alleged Lemurian knowledge. Her writings described ancient civilizations that had achieved remarkable healing capabilities through their understanding of crystal properties and geometric energy patterns. According to Raphael's accounts, modern crystal healers were recovering and adapting these ancient techniques for contemporary applications, serving as bridges between lost wisdom traditions and current spiritual needs. The geographical focus of crystal healing practices often centered on locations claimed to have special connections to Lemuria, with practitioners asserting that certain sites retained stronger energetic links to the lost continent. The crystal formations found in Arkansas, Brazil, and Madagascar were particularly valued for their supposed Lemurian connections, with dealers marketing stones from these locations as possessing enhanced healing properties due to their ancient origins. This geographical specificity created pilgrimage destinations where serious practitioners could obtain authentic Lemurian crystals while participating in group healing ceremonies and consciousness expansion workshops. Past life regression therapy experienced dramatic growth during the New Age revival, with many practitioners reporting that their clients frequently recalled incarnations in Lemuria during hypnotic sessions. These recovered memories typically featured experiences of advanced spiritual development, psychic abilities, and participation in sophisticated healing or teaching roles within Lemurian society. The consistency of these reported past life experiences across different practitioners and geographical regions was interpreted by believers as evidence for the historical reality of Lemurian civilization, though skeptics pointed to the influence of shared cultural narratives and therapist expectations on hypnotic recall. Dolores Cannon developed one of the most systematic approaches to past life regression involving Lemurian memories, conducting thousands of sessions over several decades and publishing detailed accounts of her clients' reported experiences. Her books presented elaborate descriptions of Lemurian society based on these hypnotic recollections, including information about daily life, spiritual practices, governmental systems, and the circumstances surrounding the continent's destruction. Cannon's work attracted international attention and inspired numerous other practitioners to specialize in Lemurian past life recovery. The past life narratives that emerged from these regression sessions typically portrayed Lemuria as a peaceful, spiritually advanced civilization, where individuals possessed natural psychic abilities and lived in harmony with nature and each other. Many subjects reported memories of serving as healers, teachers, or spiritual leaders who worked to preserve ancient knowledge during the continent's final period. These accounts often included dramatic scenes of the cataclysmic events that destroyed Lemuria, with individuals making heroic efforts to save sacred texts, crystals, or other important artifacts before fleeing to safety. The therapeutic applications of Lemurian past life regression extended beyond simple historical curiosity to include healing work focused on resolving supposed karmic patterns that originated during ancient incarnations. Practitioners claimed that many contemporary psychological, emotional, and physical problems could be traced to traumatic experiences during Lemuria's destruction, with individuals carrying forward unresolved grief, guilt, or fear from their ancient lives. The regression process supposedly allowed clients to process these ancient traumas and release their continuing influence on current life experiences. Mount Shasta in Northern California emerged as perhaps the most important geographical center for New Age Lemurian activities, with numerous individuals claiming that the mountain served as a refuge for survivors of the lost continent who had established an underground city beneath its slopes. These beliefs drew upon earlier theosophical teachings about hidden spiritual communities while adapting them to the specific landscape and cultural context of rural California. The mountain's imposing presence, geological uniqueness, and relative isolation made it an ideal location for projecting mystical significance and alternative historical narratives. The development of Mount Shasta as a Lemurian pilgrimage destination began during the 1930s with the writings of Guy Ballard, founder of the I Am movement, who claimed to have encountered an ascended master named Saint Germain on the mountain's slopes. Ballard's accounts described a hidden city called Telos, located within Mount Shasta, populated by survivors of both Lemuria and Atlantis, who had preserved ancient wisdom and advanced technology. These beings allegedly worked to assist humanity's spiritual evolution, while maintaining their hidden existence through advanced camouflage and dimensional shifting techniques. Aurelia Louise Jones became the most prominent contemporary advocate for Mount Shasta's Lemurian connections, claiming since the 1990s to receive channeled communications from Adama, the supposed high priest of Telos. Her books and workshops presented detailed descriptions of the underground city's society, technology, and spiritual practices, attracting thousands of visitors to Mount Shasta, who sought to make contact with its alleged Lemurian inhabitants. Jones organized regular meditation gatherings, spiritual tours, and ceremonial events designed to facilitate communication between surface dwellers and the hidden community. The Telos mythology described an advanced civilization that had survived Lemuria's destruction by relocating to underground chambers within Mount Shasta, where they had continued their spiritual evolution while developing remarkable technologies that exceeded anything known to surface humanity. These beings allegedly possessed the ability to remain youthful for thousands of years, travel instantly between dimensions, and manipulate matter through focus consciousness. Their society was portrayed as perfectly harmonious, with no conflict, competition, or scarcity due to their advanced spiritual development and technological capabilities. The commercial infrastructure that developed around Mount Shasta's Lemurian associations included numerous bookstores, crystal shops, healing centers, and retreat facilities that catered to spiritual tourists seeking connection with ancient wisdom. Local businesses promoted Lemurian-themed products, services, and experiences that range from guided mountain hikes focused on energy vortex locations to elaborate workshops promising contact with Telos inhabitants. The economic impact of this spiritual tourism became significant for the local community, creating incentives for continued promotion of Lemurian themes. Other geographical locations claimed special connections to Lemuria based on various combinations of geological features, indigenous traditions, and channeled revelations. Hawaii attracted particular attention due to its Pacific location and volcanic origins, with numerous practitioners asserting that the islands represented visible remnants of the lost continent. The presence of ancient Hawaiian temples, petroglyphs, and oral traditions about previous worlds provided apparent support for these claims, though mainstream anthropologists and archaeologists found no evidence for pre-Polynesian advanced civilizations in the Hawaiian Islands. Lake Titicaca in South America became another focus for Lemurian speculation, with some practitioners claiming that the lake marked the location of a major Lemurian colony that had survived the continent's destruction. The presence of sophisticated pre-Columbian archaeological sites around the lake, including Tiwanaku and various other ceremonial centers, was interpreted as evidence for Lemurian influence on Andean civilizations. These claims typically ignored the extensive archaeological evidence for indigenous development of Andean cultures, while selectively emphasizing features that seemed anomalous or impressive. The integration of Lemurian themes with environmental activism reflected the New Age movement's broader concerns about ecological destruction and the need for alternative relationships between humanity and nature. Practitioners often portrayed Lemuria as an ecological paradise, where advanced beings had lived in perfect harmony with natural systems, using their spiritual development to enhance rather than exploit environmental resources. The continent's destruction was interpreted as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abandoning spiritual principles in favor of materialistic pursuits. This environmental interpretation of Lemurian mythology resonated strongly with 1970s and 1980s audiences who were becoming increasingly aware of pollution, resource depletion, and other ecological problems associated with industrial civilization. The contrast between Lemuria's supposed ecological harmony and contemporary environmental destruction provided powerful motivation for spiritual seeking and lifestyle changes aimed at recovering ancient wisdom about sustainable living. Many New Age communities attempted to implement what they considered Lemurian principles in their agricultural practices, architectural designs, and community organization. The feminist spirituality movement found particular value in Lemurian mythology, interpreting the lost continent as representing a period of human development when feminine principles of intuition, cooperation, and nurturing held equal or greater importance than masculine attributes of competition, analysis, and domination. This interpretation drew upon theosophical descriptions of Lemurian hermaphroditism and spiritual development while adapting them to contemporary concerns about gender equality and the recovery of goddess-centered religious traditions. Women's spirituality groups organized ceremonies, workshops, and retreats focused on connecting with supposed Lemurian goddess traditions that had been suppressed by later patriarchal civilizations. These activities typically combined elements of neo-paganism, feminist psychology, and New Age channeling practices to create ritual frameworks for exploring feminine spiritual power. The Lemurian context provided historical legitimacy and spiritual authority for contemporary women seeking alternatives to traditional religious institutions that they perceived as male-dominated and oppressive. The psychological appeal of Lemurian spirituality for New Age practitioners involved multiple factors that address contemporary concerns about meaning, identity, and empowerment in rapidly changing social conditions. The mythology provided individuals with heroic spiritual identities as reincarnated Lemurians working to restore ancient wisdom and assist humanity's evolution. This framework transformed personal spiritual seeking into participation in a cosmic mission of planetary healing and consciousness expansion that gave ultimate significance to individual growth work and alternative lifestyle choices. The transformation of Lemurian mythology through diverse cultural lenses reveals the complex process by which Western esoteric concepts become entangled with indigenous traditions, often obscuring authentic cultural heritage while creating hybrid narratives that serve contemporary spiritual and political purposes. This phenomenon became particularly pronounced during the late 20th century, when improved global communication and increased cultural exchange created opportunities for the cross-pollination of mythological frameworks across vastly different societies and belief systems. Pacific Islander oral traditions, with their rich accounts of ancestral migrations, sunken lands, and supernatural beings, provided fertile ground for Lemurian appropriation, despite having developed independently from European esoteric speculation. The Polynesian concept of Hawaii, described in various island traditions as an ancestral homeland from which the first inhabitants had migrated, became particularly susceptible to reinterpretation through Lemurian frameworks. Traditional accounts of Hawaii varied significantly across different island groups, with some describing it as a spiritual realm, others as a distant physical location, and still others as representing the collective memory of multiple migration origins. The Maori traditions of New Zealand preserved detailed genealogical accounts that traced ancestral connections back through named individuals to primordial beings who had emerged from various cosmic realms. These Wakapapa lineages included references to Hawaii as both a physical departure point and a spiritual destination, with traditional narratives describing the great voyages that had brought Polynesian ancestors across vast oceanic distances. The sophistication of these oral historical traditions, maintained through specialized training of Tohunga, who memorized complex genealogical and geographical information, represented one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in preserving cultural knowledge across generations without written records. Western interpreters of Polynesian traditions, beginning with early missionary accounts and continuing through modern New Age literature, consistently misrepresented these sophisticated oral histories by extracting isolated elements that seem to support preconceived theories about lost continents. The concept of Hawaii was particularly vulnerable to such misinterpretation, as its spiritual and geographical dimensions could be selectively emphasized to create apparent connections with theosophical descriptions of Lemuria. This process ignored the specific cultural context that gave meaning to Polynesian narratives, while imposing external frameworks that fundamentally altered their significance. The Hawaiian tradition of the Menehune, described in various legends as a race of small people who had inhabited the islands before Polynesian settlement, became another target for Lemurian appropriation, despite clear evidence for its origins in historical encounters between different Polynesian populations. Archaeological research has demonstrated that the Hawaiian Islands experienced multiple waves of settlement, with earlier populations sometimes being displaced or absorbed by later arrivals who possess superior navigational technologies or larger numbers. The Menehune legends likely preserved cultural memories of these complex settlement patterns rather than describing supernatural beings or lost civilization survivors. Lemurian enthusiasts transformed the Menehune from historical predecessors into mystical guardians who had maintained ancient wisdom traditions in hidden valleys and underwater cities throughout the Hawaiian archipelago. This reinterpretation drew upon broader New Age themes about hidden spiritual communities while ignoring the specific cultural functions that Menehune stories served within traditional Hawaiian society. The legends had originally provided explanations for archaeological features like fish ponds and temple platforms, while encoding information about territorial boundaries, resource rights, and relationships between different social groups. The appropriation of Pacific Islander traditions for Lemurian purposes reflected broader patterns of cultural colonialism that persisted long after formal political independence had been achieved throughout the region. Western spiritual seekers, attracted by the romantic appeal of indigenous wisdom traditions, consistently extracted elements that fit their preconceived frameworks while ignoring the complex social, political, and environmental contexts that gave these traditions their authentic meanings. This selective appropriation created hybrid narratives that bore superficial resemblances to indigenous traditions while serving entirely different cultural functions. Tahitian oral traditions about the sunken island of Hawaii provided another example of how authentic Polynesian historical accounts became distorted through Lemurian interpretation. Traditional narratives described Hawaii as an ancestral homeland that had been lost beneath the ocean, with survivors establishing new settlements throughout the Pacific region. These accounts likely preserved cultural memories of actual geographical changes, including volcanic island formation and destruction, sea level fluctuations, and the abandonment of settlement sites due to environmental or social pressures. The geological reality of Pacific Island formation and destruction provided legitimate foundations for oral traditions about sunken lands as volcanic activity, coral reef development, and tectonic processes had created dynamic landscapes where islands could emerge, evolve, and disappear over relatively short time periods. The Ring of Fire's seismic activity had generated numerous catastrophic events within human memory, including volcanic eruptions that destroyed entire islands, tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements, and gradual subsidence that rendered previously habitable areas uninhabitable. Lemurian interpreters seized upon these geological realities to support their theories about continent-sized land masses that had supposedly existed in the Pacific, despite the fundamental differences in scale between documented island changes and the massive continental submersion that their theories required. The transformation of specific historical accounts about particular islands into evidence for vast lost civilizations demonstrated the systematic distortion that occurred when indigenous traditions were filtered through Western esoteric frameworks. Asian interpretations of Lemurian concepts developed along different trajectories, influenced by established traditions about lost civilizations and golden ages that had deep roots in Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist cosmology. The Hindu concept of cyclical time, with its elaborate descriptions of successive world ages characterized by different levels of spiritual development, provided natural frameworks for incorporating Lemurian themes without requiring fundamental alterations to existing belief systems. The Krita Yuga or Satya Yuga, described in Puranic literature as an initial golden age when humans possessed extraordinary spiritual powers and lived in harmony with cosmic principles, offered obvious parallels to theosophical descriptions of Lemurian civilization. Indian spiritual teachers and writers began incorporating Lemurian elements into their presentations of traditional cosmology during the early 20th century, particularly in contexts where they addressed Western audiences familiar with theosophical literature. This synthesis allowed them to present ancient Indian wisdom traditions as preserving authentic memories of lost civilizations while demonstrating the universal validity of Hindu spiritual principles. The resulting hybrid narratives combined legitimate Sanskrit sources with theosophical speculation to create teachings that appeared both traditionally grounded and mysteriously exotic. The Kumari Kandam tradition of Tamil literature provided particularly fertile ground for Lemurian adaptation, as it described a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean where an advanced Tamil civilization had supposedly flourished before catastrophic submersion forced survivors to migrate to present-day South India. These accounts, found in medieval Tamil texts like the Silapadikaram and various Puranic sources, described sophisticated urban centres, advanced learning institutions, and remarkable cultural achievements that had been lost when the continent disappeared beneath the ocean. Tamil scholars and cultural activists embrace connections between Kumari Kandam and Lemuria as validation of Dravidian civilization's antiquity and sophistication, particularly in contexts where they sought to counter North Indian claims about Aryan cultural superiority. The identification of Tamil traditions with Lemurian mythology provided historical legitimacy for assertions about South Indian cultural achievements that predated and surpassed those of other Indian populations. This political dimension of Lemurian appropriation reflected broader tensions about regional identity, linguistic rights, and cultural autonomy within the complex landscape of Indian nationalism. The transformation of Kumari Kandam from a literary device used in medieval Tamil poetry into a historical claim about actual lost continents demonstrated how traditional narratives could be reinterpreted to serve contemporary political and cultural purposes. The original Tamil sources had used Kumari Kandam as a poetic convention that provided heroic backgrounds for literary characters while expressing cultural pride and regional identity. The literalization of these poetic elements through connection with Western Lemurian theories created hybrid claims that combined legitimate cultural traditions with speculative geology and alternative archaeology. Chinese interpretations of Lemurian themes drew upon established traditions about the Kunlun Mountains as a mystical realm where immortal beings preserved ancient wisdom and supernatural technologies. Taoist literature had long described Kunlun as the dwelling place of the Queen Mother of the West and other transcendent figures who possessed the secrets of longevity, alchemy, and spiritual transformation. These traditional accounts provided natural frameworks for incorporating Western ideas about lost civilizations and hidden knowledge without requiring fundamental departures from established Chinese cosmology. The integration of Lemurian concepts into modern Chinese spiritual movements occurred primarily through the influence of Western New Age literature that had been translated and adapted for Chinese audiences. Practitioners of Qigong, meditation, and traditional Chinese medicine found that Lemurian frameworks provided useful contexts for presenting their practices to international audiences while claiming ancient pedigrees that enhanced their authority and marketability. This adaptation process typically emphasized the practical applications of supposed Lemurian knowledge rather than the elaborate cosmological frameworks that characterized Western theosophical literature. Japanese interpretations of Lemurian mythology developed through multiple channels, including direct translation of Western esoteric literature, synthesis with established Shinto traditions about hidden spiritual realms, and incorporation into popular culture through manga, anime, and video game narratives. The Japanese concept of hidden villages where ninja clans preserved ancient martial arts and supernatural abilities provided natural parallels to Western ideas about Lemurian survivors maintaining advanced knowledge in secret communities. This cultural resonance allowed Lemurian themes to be adapted relatively seamlessly into Japanese spiritual and entertainment contexts. The Mu civilization described by James Churchward gained particular popularity in Japan, where it was embraced by various new religious movements that sought to establish connections between Japanese cultural identity and ancient Pacific civilizations. These groups typically portrayed Japan as a refuge for Mu survivors who had preserved advanced spiritual teachings through Shinto traditions and imperial lineages. The resulting narratives combined legitimate Japanese historical traditions with speculative claims about Pacific prehistory to create hybrid mythologies that serve both spiritual and nationalist purposes. Western esoteric traditions demonstrated remarkable creativity in adapting Lemurian themes to fit diverse spiritual frameworks and contemporary concerns. The anthroposophical movement, founded by Rudolf Steiner as an alternative to Blavatsky's theosophy, developed its own elaborate accounts of Lemurian civilization that emphasized different aspects of spiritual evolution and cultural development. Steiner's descriptions portrayed Lemuria as a period when human consciousness was fundamentally different from modern awareness, with individuals possessing direct perception of spiritual realities but lacking the analytical thinking that characterized later evolutionary stages. Anthroposophical accounts of Lemurian society emphasized the role of advanced spiritual teachers who guided human development through direct transmission of cosmic wisdom rather than intellectual instruction. These beings, described as the first incarnations of highly evolved souls who had volunteered to assist human evolution, supposedly established mystery schools where selected individuals could receive training in spiritual perception and cosmic consciousness. The curriculum of these ancient institutions allegedly included direct experience of spiritual realms, communication with elemental beings, and manipulation of natural forces through concentrated will and intention. The technological capabilities attributed to Lemurian civilization in anthroposophical literature differed significantly from the mechanical devices described in other esoteric traditions, emphasizing instead the development of organic technologies that worked in harmony with natural processes. Steiner described Lemurian architecture as consisting of living buildings that grew from specially cultivated plants, transportation systems that utilized the life forces of trained animals, and manufacturing processes that involved direct collaboration with nature spirits and elemental beings. The destruction of Lemuria, according to anthroposophical accounts, resulted from the gradual development of individual ego consciousness that disrupted the collective spiritual awareness that had characterized earlier evolutionary stages. As Lemurians began developing personal will and analytical thinking, they lost their natural connection to spiritual guidance and began making choices that violated cosmic harmony. This evolutionary transition was portrayed as both necessary for human development and tragic in its consequences, as it led to the loss of direct spiritual perception and the beginning of humanity's long struggle to regain conscious connection with spiritual realities. Contemporary Western esoteric movements continued developing new variations on Lemurian themes throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, adapting traditional concepts to address current concerns about technology, environmental destruction, and social transformation. The emergence of internet-based spiritual communities created opportunities for rapid evolution and cross-fertilization of Lemurian narratives, with different groups contributing elements that reflected their specific interests and cultural backgrounds. Eco-spiritual movements embraced Lemurian mythology as a framework for critiquing industrial civilization, while promoting alternative approaches to technology and social organization. These interpretations typically portrayed Lemuria as an ecological paradise, where advanced beings had developed sustainable technologies that enhanced rather than exploited natural systems. The continent's destruction was interpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning spiritual principles in favour of materialistic pursuits, with obvious parallels to contemporary environmental crises. Feminist spiritual movements found particular value in Lemurian narratives that emphasized goddess worship, feminine wisdom traditions, and egalitarian social structures that supposedly characterized the lost civilization. These interpretations drew upon theosophical descriptions of Lemurian hermaphroditism and spiritual development, while adapting them to contemporary concerns about gender equality and the recovery of feminine spiritual principles. The resulting narratives typically portrayed Lemuria as representing a golden age of gender balance that had been destroyed by the rise of patriarchal civilizations focused on domination and exploitation. The distinction between indigenous cultural heritage and imposed Lemurian narratives became increasingly important as scholars and activists worked to preserve authentic traditional knowledge while challenging the appropriation of indigenous traditions by Western spiritual movements. This effort required careful analysis of how traditional accounts had been altered through contact with European ideas, identification of elements that reflected genuine cultural transmission versus external influence, and development of frameworks for protecting indigenous intellectual property from unauthorized use. The process of distinguishing authentic tradition from imposed interpretation involved multiple methodological approaches, including linguistic analysis of traditional narratives, archaeological investigation of claimed historical connections, and ethnographic documentation of how traditional knowledge was actually transmitted within indigenous communities. These investigations consistently revealed that supposed connections between indigenous traditions and Lemurian mythology had been created through selective interpretation, cultural misunderstanding, and deliberate appropriation rather than genuine historical continuity. The political dimensions of this cultural appropriation extended beyond simple misrepresentation to include economic exploitation of indigenous traditions for commercial spiritual purposes, undermining of indigenous authority over their own cultural heritage, and perpetuation of colonial attitudes that treated indigenous knowledge as raw material for Western spiritual consumption. The transformation of specific cultural traditions into generic ancient wisdom available for universal appropriation represented a continuation of colonial processes that had long denied indigenous peoples control over their intellectual and spiritual property. The emergence of the World Wide Web in the 1990s fundamentally transformed how Lemurian beliefs spread and evolved, creating unprecedented opportunities for enthusiasts to connect, share research, and develop increasingly elaborate theories about the lost continent. Early internet forums dedicated to alternative archaeology and ancient mysteries provided platforms where individuals could present their interpretations of archaeological sites, geological formations, and historical anomalies without the peer review processes that characterized academic discourse. These digital spaces operated according to different epistemological standards, where passionate conviction and creative speculation often carried more weight than empirical evidence or methodological rigor. Usenet newsgroups like alt.archaeology.esoteric and alt.paranet.ufo became early gathering places for Lemurian enthusiasts who shared scanned images from obscure books, transcripts of channeled communications, and personal theories about ancient civilizations. The synchronous nature of these early online discussions allowed participants to develop complex arguments over extended periods, building elaborate theoretical frameworks through collaborative speculation that would have been impossible in face-to-face gatherings. Contributors could spend hours researching obscure historical references, geological surveys, and archaeological reports to support their positions, creating the appearance of scholarly investigation while operating outside established academic standards. The democratization of publishing that accompanied the internet's growth enabled individuals with no formal training in archaeology, geology, or anthropology to present themselves as researchers and authorities on Lemurian topics. Personal websites proliferated throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, featuring elaborate graphics, dramatic music, and extensive collections of images allegedly depicting Lemurian artifacts, architectural remains, and geographical evidence. These sites often combined legitimate archaeological photographs with speculative interpretations, creating visual narratives that appeared convincing to visitors unfamiliar with the actual contexts of the displayed evidence. The development of search engines made it increasingly easy for curious individuals to discover Lemurian content, while the hyperlink structure of the web created networks of cross-referencing sites that reinforced each other's claims through circular citation patterns. A person searching for information about Easter Island might encounter sites that presented the Moai statues as Lemurian artifacts, then follow links to pages about Nan Madol, underwater structures off Japan, and alleged crystal skulls, creating the impression of vast bodies of evidence supporting lost continent theories. The absence of clear hierarchies distinguishing authoritative from speculative sources meant that professionally produced archaeological documentation appeared alongside amateur theories with equal visual prominence. Online forums dedicated specifically to Lemurian research emerged during the early 2000s, providing specialized spaces where believers could discuss technical aspects of their theories without skeptical interference. These communities developed their own internal cultures, complete with recognized authorities, accepted methodologies, and shared assumptions about evidence evaluation that differed dramatically from academic standards. Longtime forum members achieved status through their ability to locate obscure references, propose creative connections between disparate phenomena, and maintain consistent positions within ongoing theoretical debates. The Archive.org project and similar digital preservation initiatives inadvertently contributed to Lemurian mythology by making rare esoteric texts widely available for the first time since their original publication. Books by James Churchward, obscure theosophical treatises, and early 20th century alternative archaeology works that had been accessible only in specialized libraries suddenly became downloadable by anyone with internet access. This digital resurrection of forgotten literature provided contemporary Lemurian enthusiasts with extensive primary source materials that they could mine for supporting evidence and theoretical frameworks. Social media platforms fundamentally altered the dynamics of Lemurian communities by shifting emphasis from extended written discussions to visual content and rapid information sharing. Facebook groups dedicated to ancient mysteries and lost civilizations attracted thousands of members who shared photographs, videos, and brief commentary about alleged evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations. The platform's algorithm-driven content distribution meant that users who engaged with Lemurian material would receive increasingly frequent suggestions for related content, creating filter bubbles where alternative archaeology theories dominated their information feeds. Instagram's visual focus proved particularly conducive to spreading Lemurian content, as users shared striking images of archaeological sites, unusual geological formations, and alleged artifacts with brief captions that often presented speculation as established fact. The platform's emphasis on aesthetic appeal over textual analysis meant that visually impressive but scientifically dubious claims could achieve wide circulation based purely on their photogenic qualities. Hashtags like #Lemuria, #Ancient Civilizations, and #LostContinent created searchable networks of related content that allowed users to discover vast collections of material supporting alternative historical narratives. YouTube emerged as perhaps the most influential platform for disseminating Lemurian theories to mainstream audiences, as content creators discovered that videos about ancient mysteries and lost civilizations consistently attracted large viewerships and generated substantial advertising revenue. channels dedicated to alternative archaeology began producing professionally edited documentaries that combined dramatic narration, compelling visuals, and selective presentation of evidence to create convincing arguments for Lemurian civilization. These productions often featured impressive graphics showing hypothetical continental configurations, underwater exploration footage, and interviews with individuals presenting themselves as expert researchers. The algorithmic recommendation systems employed by YouTube created powerful mechanisms for introducing casual viewers to increasingly elaborate alternative theories about human prehistory. Someone watching a documentary about conventional archaeology might receive suggestions for videos questioning orthodox chronologies, which could lead to content about advanced ancient technologies, and eventually to full-scale presentations about Lemuria and other lost continents. This progression pathway guided millions of viewers through carefully constructed narratives that gradually normalized increasingly speculative claims about human history. Popular YouTube channels like Ancient Architects, Uncharted X, and Bright Insight attracted hundreds of thousands of subscribers by presenting alternative interpretations of archaeological sites and historical mysteries. These creators typically maintained professional presentation styles and cited legitimate archaeological sources, but selectively emphasized anomalous features while downplaying conventional explanations. Their content often focused on precision stone-cutting at ancient sites, unexplained construction techniques, and geographical patterns that seem to suggest advanced prehistoric civilizations. The comment sections beneath these videos became active forums where viewers shared their own theories, personal experiences, and additional evidence supporting alternative archaeological interpretations. These discussions often evolved into collaborative research projects where multiple participants contributed specialized knowledge about specific topics, creating crowdsourced investigations that operated parallel to but independent from academic archaeology. The democratic nature of these exchanges meant that all contributions received equal consideration regardless of their author's qualifications or methodological sophistication. Podcast platforms provided another avenue for detailed exploration of Lemurian themes, with shows like The Higher Side Chats, Mysterious Universe, and Grammarica, featuring regular episodes about lost civilizations and alternative archaeology. The long-form audio format allowed for extended discussions that could develop complex arguments over multiple hours, while the intimate nature of podcast listening created strong psychological connections between hosts and audiences. Listeners often reported feeling personally connected to podcast hosts who shared their interests in alternative historical narratives, leading to the formation of dedicated fan communities around specific shows. The proliferation of smartphone technology and mobile internet access dramatically expanded the potential audience for Lemurian content by making alternative archaeology videos and websites easily accessible during commutes, breaks, and casual browsing sessions. Apps like TikTok introduced Lemurian concepts to younger audiences through short-form videos that presented striking claims about ancient civilizations in easily digestible formats. These brief presentations often lacked the detailed argumentation found in longer content, but compensated through high production values and engaging presentation styles that made alternative theories seem exciting and credible. The challenge of information verification in the digital age became particularly acute in relation to Lemurian claims, as the vast quantity of available content made it increasingly difficult for non-specialists to distinguish between legitimate archaeological research and speculative interpretation. Professional archaeologists and historians found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of alternative theories circulating online, while their own research publications remained largely inaccessible behind academic paywalls that prevented general audiences from accessing authoritative information about prehistoric human development. The speed of information transmission through digital networks meant that inaccurate claims about archaeological discoveries or geological phenomena could achieve global circulation before experts had opportunities to provide corrections or context. Misidentified artifacts, misrepresented scientific studies, and fabricated discoveries regularly appeared in Lemurian content, where they became incorporated into larger theoretical frameworks that treated these false premises as established facts. The viral nature of social media amplification meant that corrections, when they appeared, rarely achieved the same reach as the original misinformation. Wikipedia became a crucial battleground for competing interpretations of archaeological and geological evidence related to Lemurian claims. The encyclopedia's collaborative editing model created ongoing conflicts between contributors seeking to present alternative archaeological theories and editors committed to maintaining academic standards and reliable sourcing. Articles about specific archaeological sites often featured extensive discussion pages where these disputes played out through detailed arguments about source reliability, weight of evidence, and appropriate presentation of controversial claims. The emergence of fact-checking organisations and skeptical websites provided some counterbalance to the proliferation of the alternative archaeological content, but these resources typically addressed only the most prominent or obviously false claims, while leaving more sophisticated forms of misinformation unchallenged. Sites like Snopes, Rational Wiki, and various academic blogs occasionally examined specific Lemurian assertions, but the technical complexity of archaeological and geological evidence made comprehensive debunking efforts extremely time-intensive and difficult to present in accessible formats. Modern attempts to provide scientific evidence for Lemurian theories increasingly focused on selective interpretation of legitimate geological and archaeological data, rather than relying primarily on channeled communications or mystical revelations. Contemporary proponents cited bathymetric surveys showing underwater ridges and plateaus as evidence for sunken continents, while ignoring the extensive geological research demonstrating that these features resulted from well-understood tectonic and volcanic processes. Ocean floor mapping projects that reveal detailed topography of mid-oceanic ridges and abyssal plains provided visual data that could be misrepresented to support claims about former land bridges or submerged civilizations. Satellite imagery and remote sensing technologies created new opportunities for identifying unusual geographical features that could be interpreted as evidence for ancient civilizations. Google Earth enabled amateur researchers to examine high-resolution images of remote locations worldwide, leading to numerous claims about artificial structures, geometric patterns, and architectural remains allegedly visible from space. These discoveries typically involved pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or natural formations, but were often presented as objective evidence for prehistoric advanced civilizations. Underwater archaeology projects that investigated submerged prehistoric sites provided legitimate scientific discoveries that were frequently misappropriated by Lemurian enthusiasts seeking to support their theories about sunken continents. The discovery of Neolithic settlements beneath the Black Sea, Bronze Age harbours in the Mediterranean, and Pleistocene archaeological sites on now submerged continental shelves demonstrated that sea level changes had indeed inundated human settlements throughout prehistory. However, these findings involved localized coastal sites rather than continent-sized land masses, and their chronologies corresponded to well-documented periods of post-glacial sea level rise rather than catastrophic continental submersion. The misrepresentation of plate tectonic research represented another common strategy for providing apparent scientific support for Lemurian theories. Proponents cited studies of crustal movement, continental drift, and geological hotspots, while selectively emphasizing data that could be interpreted as evidence for rapid continental submersion. The actual geological processes involved in plate tectonics operate over millions of years and involve horizontal rather than vertical continental movement, but these technical details were often omitted or misrepresented in alternative archaeology presentations. Advances in DNA analysis and population genetics provided new avenues for Lemurian interpretation, as researchers studying human migration patterns and prehistoric population movements generated data about ancient connections between geographically separated groups. The discovery of shared genetic markers between populations in Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia was cited as evidence for former land bridge connections, despite the fact that these patterns could be explained through well-documented maritime migration and trade networks. The technical complexity of genetic research made it particularly vulnerable to selective interpretation by non-specialists seeking to support predetermined conclusions about prehistoric civilizations. Live streaming platforms like Twitch and Facebook Live enabled real-time interaction between content creators and their audiences, creating more immediate and personal connections around alternative archaeology topics. These interactive formats allowed viewers to ask questions, suggest research directions, and share their own discoveries during live broadcasts, fostering collaborative investigation of Lemurian themes. The real-time nature of these interactions created strong community bonds, while also facilitating the rapid spread of misinformation through immediate amplification of unverified claims. The commercialization of online alternative archaeology content created economic incentives for producing increasingly sensational and attention-grabbing material about lost civilizations. Content creators discovered that videos promising to reveal shocking truths about ancient mysteries generated more views and revenue than measured presentations of conventional archaeological research. This economic dynamic encouraged the production of content that prioritized entertainment value over accuracy, leading to increasingly elaborate claims about Lemurian civilization and its alleged influence on human history. Subscription-based platforms like Patreon enabled alternative archaeology content creators to develop sustainable revenue streams from dedicated audiences willing to pay for exclusive content and early access to new material. These economic relationships created strong incentives for creators to maintain their audience's engagement through regular production of content supporting alternative theories, even when new evidence contradicted their claims. The financial dependence on subscriber support made it difficult for creators to acknowledge errors or modify their positions without risking audience defection and income loss. The integration of e-commerce with alternative archaeology content created opportunities for monetizing Lemurian beliefs through sales of related products, courses, and experiences. Online stores offered crystals allegedly programmed with Lemurian energy, books claiming to reveal ancient secrets, and workshop access promising to unlock hidden human potential through recovered prehistoric knowledge. These commercial enterprises provided additional economic incentives for promoting Lemurian theories while creating tangible products that reinforce believers' commitment to alternative historical narratives. The transformation of Lemuria from Philip Sclater's modest biogeographical hypothesis into a global phenomenon of alternative spirituality and pseudo-scientific speculation represents one of the most instructive case studies in how scientific ideas can evolve beyond their empirical foundations to serve entirely different cultural functions. This evolution demonstrates the complex pathways through which legitimate scientific inquiry can be appropriated, modified, and ultimately transformed into belief systems that operate according to fundamentally different epistemological principles than those governing academic research. The educational value of the Lemuria narrative lies precisely in its capacity to illuminate the mechanisms by which scientific hypotheses become cultural myths. Sclater's original proposal emerged from careful observation of biogeographical patterns that genuinely puzzled 19th century naturalists working within the theoretical constraints of their era. The absence of plate tectonic theory made land bridge explanations not merely plausible but practically inevitable for explaining the distribution of related species across ocean basins. The hypothesis represented legitimate scientific reasoning applied to available evidence using the best theoretical frameworks of its time. The transition from scientific hypothesis to mystical doctrine occurred through a series of incremental modifications that gradually divorced the concept from its empirical foundations. Ernst Haeckel's expansion of Lemuria from a biogeographical solution to a human evolutionary cradle maintained some connection to scientific evidence while introducing speculative elements that exceeded available data. Helena Blavatsky's appropriation of the concept for theosophical purposes marked a decisive break with scientific methodology, transforming Lemuria into a vehicle for channeled revelations and esoteric teachings that claimed authority through spiritual rather than empirical sources. Each subsequent elaboration of Lemurian mythology moved further from scientific constraint, while incorporating contemporary cultural concerns and spiritual aspirations. James Churchward's Mu civilization combined archaeological speculation with mystical revelation, while New Age channelers transformed the lost continent into a framework for personal empowerment and consciousness expansion. Modern internet communities have continued this process of creative elaboration, adapting Lemurian themes to address current anxieties about technology, environment, and social change. The psychological factors that contribute to the persistence of lost civilization beliefs operate at multiple levels, from individual cognitive biases to broader cultural needs for meaning and identity. At the individual level, confirmation bias plays a crucial role in sustaining belief in Lemuria, despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. Believers consistently interpret ambiguous data in ways that support their preconceptions while dismissing or ignoring information that challenges their worldview. This selective processing of evidence creates self-reinforcing belief systems that become increasingly resistant to modification through exposure to contradictory information. The availability heuristic contributes to Lemurian beliefs by making dramatic examples of alleged evidence more psychologically salient than the vast body of contradictory data. A striking photograph of precise stone cutting at an ancient site may seem more compelling than extensive archaeological documentation of the tools and techniques used in its construction, simply because the visual evidence creates stronger emotional impressions than technical analysis. The human tendency to overweight memorable examples while undervaluing statistical patterns makes it difficult for non-specialists to accurately assess the strength of evidence for alternative archaeological claims. Pattern recognition capabilities that served important survival functions in human evolutionary development can lead to false positive identifications when applied to archaeological and geological evidence. The tendency to perceive intentional design in natural formations, meaningful connections between coincidental similarities, and hidden significance in random patterns contributes to the interpretation of normal, geological and archaeological phenomena as evidence for lost civilizations. These cognitive biases operate automatically and often unconsciously, making it difficult for individuals to recognize when their pattern detection systems are generating false conclusions. The psychological appeal of secret knowledge and hidden truths provides powerful motivation for embracing alternative historical narratives that promise access to information suppressed by mainstream institutions. Belief in Lemuria often involves the conviction that conventional archaeology and geology have deliberately concealed evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations, creating a sense of special insight and intellectual superiority among believers. This conspiratorial framework transforms criticism from academic experts into confirmation of the theory's validity, since such opposition is interpreted as evidence of institutional suppression rather than legitimate scholarly disagreement. Sociological factors that sustain lost civilization beliefs include the formation of communities organized around shared alternative worldviews that provide social support, intellectual stimulation, and collective identity for their members. Lemurian believers often develop strong social bonds through their participation in online forums, conferences, and local meetup groups, where their interests and beliefs receive validation from like-minded individuals. These communities create social environments where alternative archaeological theories are treated as legitimate research programs rather than fringe speculation, providing psychological reinforcement for beliefs that receive little support from mainstream institutions. The democratization of information through digital technologies has created conditions where alternative theories can develop substantial followings without requiring validation from traditional academic gatekeepers. Online platforms allow individuals to access vast quantities of information while providing tools for creating professional-appearing presentations of alternative theories. The absence of clear hierarchies distinguishing authoritative from speculative sources means that amateur theories can achieve widespread circulation based on their entertainment value, visual appeal, or emotional resonance rather than their empirical support. Economic incentives within the alternative archaeology community create pressures for producing increasingly sensational claims about lost civilizations to maintain audience engagement and revenue streams. Content creators who depend on views, subscriptions, and product sales have strong motivations to present dramatic theories about ancient mysteries rather than measured discussions of conventional archaeological research. These commercial dynamics encourage the development of increasingly elaborate alternative theories, while discouraging acknowledgement of errors or modification of positions based on new evidence. The importance of scientific literacy in distinguishing between evidence-based theories and speculative mythology becomes increasingly critical as information technologies make vast quantities of both legitimate research and alternative theories easily accessible to general audiences. Scientific literacy involves not merely familiarity with specific scientific facts, but understanding of the methodological principles that distinguish reliable from unreliable sources of information. This includes appreciation for peer review processes, understanding of how scientific consensus develops through replication and verification, and recognition of the difference between speculation and established knowledge. Effective scientific education must address not only the content of scientific knowledge, but the processes through which that knowledge is generated, tested, and refined. Students need to understand how archaeological chronologies are established through multiple independent dating methods, how geological theories are tested through field observation and laboratory analysis, and how biogeographical patterns are explained through integration of evidence from multiple disciplines. This procedural understanding provides tools for evaluating new claims about prehistoric civilizations according to the same standards applied to other scientific hypotheses. Critical thinking skills that enable individuals to evaluate the quality of evidence and identify logical fallacies become essential for navigating the complex information landscape surrounding alternative archaeology. These skills include the ability to distinguish between correlation and causation, recognize when conclusions exceed available evidence, and identify when selective presentation of data creates misleading impressions about complex phenomena. The development of such analytical capabilities requires practice in applying logical principles to concrete examples rather than abstract instruction about reasoning processes. Media literacy education must address the specific techniques used in alternative archaeology presentations to create impressions of scientific authority while avoiding the methodological constraints that characterize legitimate research. Students need to recognize how professional production values, selective citation of sources, and dramatic presentation styles can make speculative theories appear credible to audiences unfamiliar with the underlying evidence. This includes understanding how visual media can be used to support predetermined conclusions through careful selection and framing of images. The broader context of human fascination with lost worlds and ancient mysteries reflects deep psychological needs that extend far beyond specific claims about prehistoric civilizations. The appeal of lost continent narratives draws upon fundamental human concerns about meaning, identity, and transcendence that have motivated religious and philosophical speculation throughout history. Understanding these underlying motivations provides insight into why alternative theories about ancient civilizations continue to attract substantial audiences despite their lack of empirical support. The romantic appeal of lost civilizations satisfies contemporary longings for connection with imagined golden ages when humanity supposedly possessed greater wisdom, spiritual development, or technological sophistication than current societies have achieved. These narratives provide psychological refuge from modern anxieties about environmental destruction, social fragmentation, and technological alienation by projecting idealized alternatives onto prehistoric periods. The destruction of these imagined civilizations serves as cautionary tales about the consequences of abandoning spiritual principles or misusing advanced technologies. Lost continent mythologies also function as vehicles for exploring contemporary concerns about human potential and social organization through the projection of utopian ideals onto ancient settings. Descriptions of Lemurian society typically emphasize features that contrast with perceived deficiencies in modern civilization, including spiritual harmony, ecological balance, technological wisdom, and social cooperation. These idealized reconstructions reveal more about current cultural values and aspirations than about actual prehistoric conditions. The persistence of alternative historical narratives in popular culture demonstrates the ongoing tension between scientific and mythological approaches to understanding human origins and development. While academic research has provided increasingly sophisticated accounts of human evolution, migration patterns, and cultural development, these scientific narratives often lack the emotional resonance and dramatic appeal of mythological alternatives. The complexity and technical nature of legitimate archaeological and geological research makes it less accessible to general audiences than simplified alternative theories that promise hidden knowledge and dramatic revelations. The phenomenon of Lemuria ultimately illustrates the complex relationship between scientific knowledge and cultural meaning-making in modern societies. Scientific research provides powerful tools for understanding natural phenomena and human history, but it operates according to methodological constraints that limit its capacity to address questions about ultimate meaning, purpose, and value. Alternative theories like Lemuria fill gaps in scientific explanation by providing comprehensive worldviews that integrate factual claims with spiritual beliefs, moral teachings, and personal identity frameworks. The challenge for contemporary education and public communication lies in acknowledging the legitimate human needs served by mythological narratives, while maintaining clear distinctions between empirically supported knowledge and speculative belief systems. This requires developing approaches to science education that address both the content and the limitations of scientific knowledge, while providing alternative frameworks for addressing questions about meaning and purpose that science cannot answer. The goal is not to eliminate human fascination with mystery and transcendence, but to channel these interests in directions that enhance, rather than undermine, scientific literacy and critical thinking. The legacy of Lemuria serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of methodological rigor in distinguishing between legitimate scientific hypotheses and unfounded speculation. As new technologies continue to generate vast quantities of information about human prehistory and Earth's geological development, the ability to evaluate evidence according to established scientific standards becomes increasingly crucial for maintaining the distinction between knowledge and belief. The story of Lemuria's transformation from scientific hypothesis to cultural myth provides essential lessons for navigating the complex information landscape of the 21st century while preserving the integrity of scientific inquiry and the human capacity for wonder and imagination.